So hey anime fans, the series name is What If God Like Naruto Went Into Avatar The Last Airbender. So let's start the series. Immortality is a funny thing. Some might think it a gift from the gods themselves. Wouldn't it be wonderful to live forever? To never age? Never die? Would not one call that a blessing? Ha! More like a curse, for what else can this be? To watch your friends grow old, while you yourself remain young? Letting them move on with their lives, start families of their own, grow old, to stand there helpless as they wither and die, as you lay those flowers upon each their graves, knowing you were powerless to defeat time itself? The one enemy even I could not hope to defeat. But I digress. I'm sure you're wondering who I am. I have seen and done much in my time, and I'm not necessarily proud of it all. I have helped nations rise and fall, civilizations have crumbled in less than an hour at my hand, fought the war to end all wars, witnessed the end of the shinobi, traveled to distant lands. I have loved and I have lost, outliving each and every one of my wives and children, helpless to do anything but weep. My tales are many, and my exploits great. I have carved my name into the elemental nations as they were once known 100-fold, and still I am unsatisfied. I am the last of the dying breed, doomed to reincarnate time and time again until I've fulfilled my purpose. I cannot age, but I can die. If one wishes to know the pain of a spear through their heart, or the painful end of decapitation, you need only ask me. My deaths are many, my lives seemingly infinite. Now, as this century-old war rages in this land, once again, I feel compelled to act. If not for myself, then for the needs of others. I swear, I'm such a masochist, always throwing myself into the fire for others. What irony! Immortality is indeed a funny and fickle thing, ain't it, folks? Which is how I come to find myself here, in this distant place, in the oddest of situations. My name is Uzumaki Naruto, Avatar of the Gods, and this is my story. Wet. Naruto was not a fan of water in general. Oh, he drank the stuff, of course, even swam, whenever the whim struck him, but he did not, by any means, enjoy being doused from head to toe, especially not this early in the morning. Certainly not when he'd elected to accompany two rambunctious children out here in pursuit of fish. It didn't help when one of said children didn't want his help. But their grandmother had been unusually adamant this morning, so here he was, the tribe's last remaining man, babysitting. Honestly, he was getting too old for this. He might be physically trapped at the age of 16, yet that didn't make it any less ridiculous. These people had taken him in, offered him food and shelter. Starvation was one of the worst ways to off himself, not to mention furs when there were virtually none to be found. Perhaps that was why he stayed. He felt he owed these people, and by definition, their children, including, much to their occasional consternation as well as his own, Sokka and Katara. A moment ago he'd been laughing when she'd accidentally doused her brother with water in an attempt to catch a fish. Then she had gone and gotten him wet. Now, Naruto was no stranger to the cold. But he was not enjoying the sensation, not in the least. His sole satisfaction was that he'd managed to catch said fish before it could escape back into the seat. He made for quite a sight, his crystal blue eyes shadowed by sopping wet bangs, his lips quirked downward in a slight frown, gloved mitten clenching tight their hard-earned dinner. Katara! Sorry! Oh, you will be! Naruto grinned and shook himself like a wet dog, spattering her with droplets. Take this. Hey! His grin grew another inch. One good turn deserves another. He nimbly dodged aside when she flung a small wave at him in retaliation, thus dousing Sokka even further. The small torrent violently tore the boy's spear from his grasp just before he could successfully skewer his first fish, sending his precious weapon arcing end over end before finally sinking to the water below. Within seconds it was gone, plummeting to the depths and out of sight. A small cry of surprise left his lips. That gobsmacked expression was simply too good to pass up. Both teens burst into laughter. Will the two of you please stop playing your little water games? They're not games, Sokka, Katara admonished. They're right, an ancient art indigenous to our tribe. Naruto began to tune their bickering out as the canoe drifted through the ice pack. Southern water tribe or not, the girl had a remarkable amount of spirit. Admirable. She would have made a fine shinobi. Back in the elemental nations, the whole bending concept was entirely beyond him. But that didn't mean he was lacking in understanding. These people utilized their chi in the same way he wielded chakra. Bending wasn't all that uncommon, either was it rare, either. He'd been utterly amazed by the sheer ingenuity of some benders when he'd first come here. Perhaps amazed hadn't been quite the right word. Dazzled, perhaps? His first visit since his arrival a century before had been to the Fire Nation. He marveled at their destructive art of the Inferno, reminding him so much of the Uchiha with their self-righteous arrogance. Then, the Earth Kingdom with their grand, yet stoic simplicity, and the reclusive yet light-haired air nomads. He'd spent many months creating new jutsu just by witnessing their uncanny manipulation of air currents. Finally, it was to the water tribe which he'd found himself drawn. The war had broken out shortly thereafter. He'd been in the process of evacuating civilians when the Fire Nation killed him. It had taken an entire armada and nearly 1,000 men to do the deed. He'd only been reborn about a handful of years ago in the same place he'd perished, cold, naked, alone. Yup, reincarnation was a bitch and a half. And apparently he wasn't the only one trapped in this wretched cycle of rebirth. There was this supposed figure, the Avatar, a master of all four elements, meant to preserve peace between the four nations. If so, then where the devil was he? Naruto had never met the man. But anyone doomed to be reborn over and over again had to be one hell of a cynic. He'd only died a handful of times, and each time had been more painful than the last. If the Avatar had gone through the same thing, then he might meet a man. Surely the man hadn't just been hiding out for the last century, had he? No, of course not. No one was that much of a coward, not even him. Nevertheless, a certain degree of caution had to be exercised whenever utilizing his own abilities. Couldn't have everyone thinking he was the Avatar now, could he? Even waterwalking, as he was doing now, drew a fair amount of attention from those not acquainted with it. If he were to bust out his dojutsu or any of the techniques he'd gained from absorbing the jubi during in the war, he'd probably have half the nation trying to kiss his feet, or worse. If the Fire Nation found out, not that all of them were bad, there was that Iroh fellow, but regardless, he wasn't exactly eager to be hunted down again. He might not be an avatar of the elements, but he was certainly an avatar of something else. Look out! The blonde jerked his head upwards, drawn from his reverie just in time to witness the inexplicable, for all intensive purposes, appeared to be an iceberg rising from the depths of the ocean in their path, and they were hurtling towards it. A subtle exertion of Shinra Tensei prevented Sokka and Katara from dashing their canoe against this great glacier, but only just. They were still flung from the boat before he could think to stop them, sent sprawling head over heels in a hilarious tumble of arms and legs. "You kids okay?" Katara mumbled something. Sokka's exclamation was a great deal less reserved. "What's that?" Naruto eyed it warily. This frozen sphere that stood before them, was that a kid in there? Unthinking, he chopped down, hard, higher. The icy cage split and twined before the savage chop, releasing a great geyser of steam, and light. Did he mention light? Scarce had his gloved hand touched the eerie orb than a beam of light burst into existence. Hurtling upward and into the heavens, a frightening sonic boom shook their surroundings, shattering the fragile canoes, shattering beneath the sudden onslaught of air and sound. Naruto hissed, not out of fear or awe, or even his own sense of self-preservation, but the knowledge that anyone for miles around would be able to see this, anyone, including any Fire Nation vessels. Oh crap! Meanwhile, leagues away, Prince Zuko saw it, and how could he not? Rocketing into the heavens like an arrow loose from a bow, the great pillar of light dominated his vision, demanding his all, his attention, his everything. He could feel it calling out to him like a clarion call. The return of his honor merely a few miles to the north. A single thought dominated his mind, turning his scarred face intent with fury. It did not matter to him when it cut off abruptly. He already knew his heading, knew what did await him there, not just the fight of his life, but the chance to finally, at long last, return home. At long last, I found him. That which his father, grandfather, and even his great-grandfather had been unable to find. The Avatar. With a brisk stride he stalked past his guards and into the bowels of the ship, dutifully ignoring his uncle when he asked to join him for tea. Zuko did not have time for tea, not when his destiny awaited. Perhaps had he lingered he might have noticed Iroha's slight smile in passing, might have heard his words, but as it stood Zuko did not listen. Instead, he stormed into the cabin and issued a fateful order that would forever reshape his life in ways he had yet to foresee. Unknowing of this, he still gave the order. "Helmsman, head for the light." "Naruto, what are you doing?" exclaimed Sokka as the blonde extricated his palm from what had, mere moments before, been a sphere of ice. No longer, The second that beam of light had gone up, the former shinobi'd all but attacked the sphere, shredding it to pieces with his bare hands until the light finally dissipated. Now that it had, he'd slowed his assault. Katara could see that his gloves were gone, burned away by the intensities of his strikes, reduced now to little more than rags wrapping his hands. Getting him out, the blonde shook his still-numbed hands in a vain effort to warm them. Ain't that obvious, Era? It looks like we've been beaten to the punch. Both boys turned their attention to the melted glacier, now aware of Katara cradling its occupant. Laying there amidst the ice and snow, his body still glowing ever so slightly, was a boy, but not just any boy. An airbender, the last airbender. Yes, that was the day everything changed, the day we uncovered the Avatar, A/N. And there you have it. A seemingly immortal Naruto who is cursed to be reborn over and over again until he fulfill his mysterious purpose. Doubtlessly this was caused by absorbing the Jubi and all its ungodly chakra, but why does Naruto keep reincarnating as the same person, and with his memories intact? What might that purpose be? It's anyone's guess. It could be something quite simple, such as securing peace for the entire world, or something more complex. In any case, expect the Avatar universe to be filled with hilarity. Anywho, I worked extremely hard on this one, so I hope to hear what you think. Pairing is up in the air. You decide, so in the immortal words of Atlas. Review, would you kindly? And of course, enjoy the preview. Preview. Naruto laughed as Zuko's fist swung harmlessly over his head. The blast of fire that came with the strike was batted aside so effortlessly it may as well not have existed at all. Was this what amounted to taijutsu these days? Pitiful. Absurd. An errant gust of wind chakra was all it took to keep the boy off balance, and summarily off his back. He simply couldn't make any progress against the headwind. Ha! Your great-grandfather was better than this, the prince snarled. Fight me like a man, Avatar. Look, the blonde drawled as he battled the boy backwards. How many times do I have to tell you I'm not the Avatar? His words ended in a resounding whoosh as he summoned forth a great geyser of water from deep within his stomach, spewing the violent wave forward, extinguishing the fiery blast and bowling the prince head over heels. But the young firebender simply would not go down. Scarce had he fallen than he was up again, flinging himself at the former Jinchuriki in furious fashion. Stop lying! Only the Avatar could manipulate the elements like that. Naruto's deadpan was barely concealed. Oh, for the love of, why are you staring at me? This from Aang, the boy who, unbeknownst to everyone else, was the Avatar. Naruto stubbornly stifled the urge to reveal that Aang would so when he was ready, or so he hoped. He was hesitant to pin his trust on an untested youth. But hadn't he been the same once? To assume Aang was a coward merely for safeguarding his secret would imply that Naruto too was one and the same, unwilling to risk death by exposing himself to the world with his godlike powers and prowess. But he did not hide his powers out of cowardice. It was wisdom that stayed his hand. Wielding that much power, letting the world know what you were only made you that much more of a target. Perhaps Aang was of a similar mind. Perhaps not. In a way, they were almost alike. Regardless, it wasn't for Naruto to judge. Oh, nothing. Nevertheless, he allowed a small smile to creep up on his lips. It's just my first time meeting the Avatar. His words were soft, spoken only for the two of them, and yet they still elicited the most startling reaction in the young airbender. For a brief moment, the young boy actually looked afraid. Said fear was just as swiftly replaced by sorrow. The resigned sort that suggested he'd known this was coming all along. Most curious, the Avatar of the gods mused to himself. How did you know? Naruto finished with the slightest of sighs. It wasn't that difficult. I've studied this nation's history. If that flash of power before didn't give you away, then the markings certainly did, honestly. I'd expected you to be a little taller, though, older too, but then again, I guess cryogenically freezing yourself for 100 years is one hell of a way to ease out the wrinkles, no? He allowed his gaze to slip past the baffled boy toward his young wards, observing Sokka and Katara with their tribe. They'll probably figure it out sooner rather than later, so are you going to tell them? Or should I? Aang faltered, momentarily uncertain of what to say. Just who was this strange youth, and why did he seem so familiar somehow? He hadn't said a word on the ride back to the tribe courtesy of Appa, and now suddenly it was as if the blonde could read his very thoughts. What was going on here? There's no rush. Ironically, Naruto felt his heart go out to the boy with these words. You can tell them when you're ready. For all his feigned cheer and supposed legendary status, Aang was little more than that, a child. But there was more to it than being young and untested. Aang reminded him of himself. He'd been the same way at first, not wanting anything to do with these incredible powers bestowed upon him. In the beginning, he had tried and failed to live a normal life. Looking back, it was rather obvious why he had failed. One simply did not absorb the Jubi into oneself and expect to lead an existence anything short of extraordinary. At first there had been worship, his comrades had respected him, women had practically fallen over another to have his children, and so on. For a terribly long time, he had been reluctant to assume his new role. He didn't want anything to do with these supposed fangirls or their ilk. He only had eyes for a certain Hyuga, Hinata. Her confession had never been far from his mind, but there hadn't been any time to discuss it. What with Akatsuki lurking about and then the war and Madara. By the time everything ended and the Jubi was harmlessly, or so he thought, made one with his soul, nearly a year had passed, more than enough time for him to think on her words. And when things finally settled down, finally able to call her out on it, the rest, well, as they say, is history. Time had flown by so swiftly afterward. Now more than ever he wished he could go back and revisit those first few years, cherish them, before he realized anything was wrong, before it became apparent that he wasn't changing, wasn't aging, but he'd been so caught up in their relationship. And then the twins came along, and still he pushed it off, dismissing it as nothing. Lie after lie became increasingly apparent. He was simply aging well. It was his genes, yes, that had to be it. Looking back, he'd been far too naive, reluctant. That reluctance had nearly been the end of him. Everyone saw him as a god in human form at the time, a guardian meant to watch over the shinobi people for all time, not as the Hokage, but something more, as an avatar of the gods. To this day, Naruto wasn't sure who had coined that eerie moniker, but for whatever reason it had stuck, so that was what he became, eventually trading his dream to become Hokage for this newfound role and status. And for a while, things were working out swimmingly. Sasuke had returned to the village, his promise with Sakura now satisfied, and he had a budding family in Hinata, as Hokage. Tsunade was able to help him keep the peace, and awkward as he might be, he'd done a good job of keeping the other nations in line. So he wasn't aging, big deal. A mere fly in the ointment. A simple henge kept anyone from realizing the truth, and it wasn't as though he'd been lying to anyone. With his newfound powers he'd slowly begun to assume his new responsibilities. Peace was flourishing. The people were happy, and then, as suddenly as the peace had begun, everything went to hell. You're not exactly normal yourself. Naruto blinked, unexpectedly drawn from his pained reverie by Aang's words. He was momentarily amused to find the boy peering up at him with what was the word again? Compassion? Empathy? Whatever the case, Aang's attention was enough to momentarily banish the demons of his long and lengthy past. I'm sorry, did you say something? When next Naruto spoke, it was not the sorrowed shinobi of the elemental nations, but the stoic avatar of the gods, granted, taking on the role, growing into it over time, learning to respect the need for secrecy, adopting the title even now. It was all just a way of distancing himself from the pain he still felt in the depths of his heart, whereas Aang's outlook on life was probably a great deal cheerier than his own. In any case, perhaps he should mirror that same levity? I said, the last airbender continued, you're not so different yourself. Oh? That got Naruto's attention. This boy was more than he appeared. Intrigued, he turned his sapphiric gaze toward the monk-to-be once more. And what makes you say that, Aang? Quashing the pain he felt within his heart, he forced a small smile back to his face and awaited the avatar's answer. Oh, what he wouldn't give for Kurama's voice in his head right about now. It's your eyes. The boy seemed to squirm beneath his gaze. They seem old, somehow. You'd be right. Naruto found himself biting back laughter for the first time since his last death. If I had to guess, I'd say they're 500, give or take a century or two. What? It's just a guess, the blonde shrugged. No need to freak out. Time sorta loses its meaning when you've lived as long as I have. Still, freezing yourself an interesting trick. I think I'll have to try that myself someday. Well, I wouldn't recommend it. So you're really an airbender, eh? Naruto asked abruptly. Aang grinned, glad for the change in topic. Sure am. Can you show me? Aang chose that precise moment to sneeze. The subsequent expulsion of air sent him rocketing nearly 10 feet into the air. That little spectacle earned the attention of the entire tribe, not to mention a certain someone, before he descended with grace, landing almost effortlessly upon Appa's back. ending his little air trick with a graceful bow. As if to echo his partner's effort, the sky bison loosed a happy snort. Not bad, huh? Impressive, Naruto admitted, clapping as the bender clambered down from his mount. You've got a lot of skill for someone so young. Hey, thanks, but can you do this? Now it was Aang's turn to balk, because scarce had Naruto spoken than the last airbender found himself witness to the inexplicable. Naruto, in the time it had taken to finish that sentence, had levitated his body up off the ground and into the air. He was hovering, without a glider. He simply hung there, suspended in midair. What's more, he didn't seem to be expending any visible effort at all. But it wasn't as though he were flying in actuality, Aang thought. If he could, then why would he? Wahahaha. Then, as if to shatter that very thought, the former Jinchuriki shed his fur coat and erupted upward, his body little more than a streak of blue and black colors as he tore into the skies. What the heck? Sokka scrubbed at his eyes with both hands, as though the action could somehow wipe away what he was seeing. Is Naruto actually flying? Katara practically squealed in delight at the sight, her earlier reservation forgotten in the wake of this discovery. For indeed the blonde was doing just that, navigating the air using his own chakra to hold/hoist him aloft, wrapping himself in it, and pushing down against the ground simultaneously. It was no means an easy feat. Only one with a strong wind affinity could do such a thing, and even then, Naruto himself had spent nearly an entire decade mastering the technique. It was not, as a certain man might have said, a move for beginners. Wow, so you're an airbender too? I am not a bender, Naruto denied, alighting soundlessly beside Katara. My situation is unique. Like how? Like, he would have said more, had not something brightened the skies over their heads. Blue eyes bulged. Incoming. That was all they heard before a massive ball of fire lit the horizon. Aang barely saw the Fire Nation vessel from whence it came before it engulfed their position. But where had this vessel come from, and how had they found them so swiftly? Too late. There was no longer any time for thought. The projectile ripped into the water tribe and sent everything flying. The villagers were only just able to escape the blast radius thanks to their relative distance of the explosion. Katara wasn't so lucky. The detonation flung her and Sokka away, sending both brother and sister sprawling in the snow. In that instant, Naruto shouted something from up above their heads. Exactly what, the young avatar knew not, only that the flames abruptly vanished, disintegrating into harmless steam as he looked on. Assholes! Naruto landed in a roaring snarl of fire, spitting curses not meant for the ears of young children. Some of those very words caused Katara to flush, but the sight of him stole any sentiment of laughter away. Black flames rippled off and around his body, and it seemed as though his eyes were bleeding. Impossible to tell. Whatever the case may be, she had only an instant to recognize any of this before unconsciousness took her before the blonde haired Aang behind him, just in time for the ramp of the enemy vessel to lower. Stay behind me, was the last thing she heard. 7 firebenders marched down the ramp in a phalanx, and at their head, a younger man, clearly their leader. Where are you hiding him? The prince demanded to know, scowling. He grabbed hold of Katara's grandmother, shaking her cowl for emphasis. He'd be about this age, master of all elements. I know he's here. None dared speak. Faced with this refusal, Zuko became incensed. If you don't reveal him, I'll burn this entire village to the ground. Aang was just about to open his mouth, ready to reveal himself for the sake of these people, when, Amaterasu, the blonde muttered that word and the firebenders burned, their plated armor erupting in thick tongues of dark fury as she looked on. Of the 6 guards that had accompanied the prince, only one managed to evade the worst of the blaze besides him. Rolling aside and out of harm's way, Naruto simply exhaled and that hapless fool ceased to exist, his body evaporating before a massive fireball all his own. Why firebender? Why does everyone think that? Naruto groaned, slapping a flaming palm to his forehead. It's not like Io, he blinked, finally noticing the flames of his chakra creeping around him, the still smoldering bodies around the lot of them. Hoops, forgot about that. Chakra tends to get a little out of whack when I'm pissed off, you know. But I digress. A wave of the hand and the flames abated somewhat, forming a shimmering aura of black and crimson around his form. The noise that followed would be impossible to do justice to using simple onomatopoeic sound effects. It was not quite a VOM. A simple VROM doesn't suffice either, but these are about the closest approximations. For Prince Zuko, the sound equated to one singular emotion, fear. Aang, Naruto whispered, How many people can Appa carry? About 10, the Avatar found himself replying. It'll have to do, try to get out of here, I'll buy you some time. What are you whispering about? Like an iron trap, Naruto's gaze locked onto the prince's own, the sheer intensity of his stare, the sudden ice in his expression, was enough to silence the entire tribe. Nothing moved, nothing at all. And then he spoke, voice black as pitch, eyes cold as the coldest winter, a sharp contrast to the flames boiling around his body. These people are precious to me. The words were little more than a dry hiss. If a knife could talk, this was what it would sound like. Any attack on them is an attack on myself. And I don't take very kindly to being set upon by the likes of Fire Nation thugs like Yosef. He pointed one long finger at the proud prince. I suggest you get back on your boat, and before you get yourself hurt, boy, do you have any idea who you're speaking to? Zuko's scarred eye twitched in anger and outrage. I could ask you the same thing. Naruto's grin grew another inch, exposing deadly canine teeth. But since you seem to think I'm a firebender, let's play a little game. He stepped forward, reached out towards the bulk of their vessel, and made a pulping motion with his right hand. If I win, I get to peel your ship like a banana and set you adrift for a few days. You win, and I'll give you the Avatar. Tell me, my dear prince, are you at all familiar with the term Agni Kai? What? Zuko spluttered. How dare you suggest such a thing, you traitor? Naruto snarked. It seems I've struck an old wound. Wouldn't have anything to do with that mark now, would? Zuko let loose an emotionally toiled scream and lunged, fists ablaze. I'll kill you! Go, Aang! Naruto roared, a heartbeat before the prince pounced upon him. And then he no longer had any time to worry about anyone other than himself. Fighting at full strength was one thing, but to actively restrain himself from using his full potential against such a lesser opponent soon proved far more difficult, or not. Naruto laughed as Zuko's fist swung harmlessly over his head, too wide, not narrow enough. The blast of fire that came with the strike was batted aside so effortlessly it may as well not have existed at all. Was this what amounted to taijutsu these days? Pitiful! Absurd! He clapped his hands and flung them outward. That easy, effortless gust of wind chakra was all it took to keep the boy off balance, and summarily off his back. He simply couldn't make any progress against the headwind. Ha! He scolded. What's wrong, Zuko? Your great-grandfather was better than this. The prince snarled, utterly unaware of the bison rising behind him. Fight me like a man, Avatar. Naruto scoffed and spat a small fireball. Look, the blonde drawled as he battled the boy backwards. How many times do I have to tell you I'm not the Avatar? His words ended in a resounding whoosh as he summoned forth a great geyser of water from deep within his stomach, spewing the violent wave forward, extinguishing the fiery blast and bowling the prince head over heels. But the young firebender simply would not go down. Scarce had he fallen than he was up again, flinging himself at the former Jinchuriki in furious fashion. Stop lying! He snarled between blows. Only the Avatar could manipulate the elements like that. Naruto's deadpan was barely concealed. Oh, for the love of fine! You want me to fight like a firebender? Naruto shrugged, and it suddenly seemed that a great weight had been lifted from him, a tremendous effort he no longer had to sustain. Then I'll fight like a firebender. With a laugh he thundered forward, nearly clotheslining the poor prince. What did you do? Zuko hissed, panic edging into his voice as he skittered backwards. Naruto's gleeful expression certainly didn't help any. I decided to fight you seriously. Appa? Aang's voice seemed to come from a great distance. Yip, yip. Katara managed to open her eyes, but the world wouldn't stay still and stopped shaking. The ringing in her ears wouldn't stop either. Sitting up was not as hard as she expected, but a loud rustling broke through the ringing of her Rar's piles of snow. Subtle shifted, thrown off not by her meager arms, but by the blazing heat of the atmosphere itself. The most casual application of the combatant's strength. She could feel the rest of their tribe stirring nervously around her, small as it was. They all fight on Appa's back, the easier to be fielded to safety. As she stepped slowly back into the land of consciousness, she gradually became aware of a rhythmic crashing noise. The footfalls of a sprinting giant. Her chi sense was the last to return, and with that to aid her, she was finally able to pinpoint the sources of the noise. Only a few yards below, Prince Zuko was still furiously attacking Naruto, relentlessly hammering down blows on the blonde's guard, which stubbornly held, that in and of itself, the fusion of her friend's refined martial arts skill, the product of decades of dedicated training, and his own monstrous natural power, gave him an unbelievably quick, fluid and adaptable defense, and when he moved on to the attack, each strike was carefully calculated for maximum effect, almost impossible to follow, and devastating when it landed. It was like watching a river flow, not a single movement was wasted, and Zuko was overwhelmed. The younger boy didn't stand a chance. When he tried to retreat, the blonde cut him off. When he sought to strike and attack, Naruto simply absorbed all his blows, and while the occasional fist would slip through, he didn't seem to much care for the burns. Always Naruto was there, pressing the offensive with a single-minded ferocity bordering on downright primal instinct. Abruptly as their bout began, it was over. Zuko toppled backwards from a fireball to the chest, his armor shattering, stomach now badly burned. Naruto bounded after him, swiped him off his feet with a single hand, ready to deal the final blow. Zuko gazed back at him, golden eyes defiant, ready to accept whatever fate might be his. Finish it, Avatar. Before Katara could think to say anything, lest she tried to stop him, the blonde struck down, hard, not with his fist, but with his head, the final blow not dealing death, yet rendering the prince insensate all the same. He rose stiffly after that, Naruto did, extracting what looked like a small brush and ink from his coat pocket. He promptly set to work on Zuko's face seconds thereafter, his fine brush strokes growing maddened and erratic as he hastened to complete his work before the proud prince stirred. Whatever he was writing, Katara couldn't see it, but it seemed to be sending Sokka into a fit of hysterical laughter. Then, incredibly, Naruto spoke not to Zuko, but to the ship itself, or perhaps he spoke to the portly figure sitting upon its bow. Iroh! He shouted, I'll let your nephew live, this time. Tell him he needs to be stronger to face me. Speaking of which, you may want to hang on. With that, he pointed hand toward the ship, then he did something inexplicable. In the blink of an eye, without any discernible motion on his part, he destroyed the vessel's engines, warped its hull, and bodily wrenched the ice cutter onto land with a not-so-subtle application of Shinra Tensei. Another leap sent the blonde soaring into the air, and onto Appa's saddle. When asked if he was all right, the whiskered warrior merely grunted. I've had enough excitement for one day, A/N, and there you have it. A slight change there in that Zuko found them without the flare from the abandoned boat, but a necessary one to speed things along, I think, and for all his power, he still got his ass handed to him in hilarious fashion, thus setting us up for the many adventures you've all come to know and love. In any case, expect the Avatar universe to be filled with hilarity, no absolute insanity now that Naruto's aboard. Anywho, I worked extremely hard on this one, so I hope to hear what you think. Pairing is up in the air. You decide. And on a final note, thank you to everyone offering emotional support in regard to my health woes. It's greatly appreciated. So in the immortal words of Atlas, review would you kindly? And of course, enjoy the preview. Azula smiled then. It was a soft, deadly, dangerous thing, that smile. Well, what do we have here? She chuckled. You mean to say you're the Avatar that I've heard so much about? You certainly are handsome. Despite himself and all his power, Naruto actually blanched. Ah, Christ. Naruto stubbornly resisted the urge to open his eyes, refusing to turn his head and peer over a shoulder as Aang popped up behind him. Thank the gods Appa could fly himself. Instead of giving in to his own curiosity, he forced his mind to focus on the task at hand. Not now, Aang, he chided. I'm trying to concentrate. He was sitting in a meditative position and concentrating on his outstretched right hand. After a few seconds, what looked like blue chi to Aang began to swirl around his palm. It began to compress in upon itself as more and more began form and swirl. Soon enough, floating a few inches above his palm was a blue spinning orb. He saw Naruto's eyes focus on the orb, and it began to spin even faster and form 4 white blades spinning with the orb. As he watched the orb spin, the last Airbender could have sworn he heard a low thrumming, like something was trying to cut the air itself. What in the world is that? The orb continued to spin, growing larger and larger, encompassing his entire palm until Naruto let out a sigh and relaxed, letting the orb disappear. Good, he said to himself. I've STLL got it. It was then that he became aware of everyone's attention. Katara had paused and stitching Sokka's pants to gawp at him, her mouth forming a small, round O of disbelief. Sokka looked as though he'd been preparing another one of his infamous jokes, but the sight of the mini raisin shuriken seemed to have stolen those words away. Finally, he looked at Aang. apparently confused by the boy's bowed head and lack of reaction. Is something the matter? That was so cool. The sheer force of Boy's exultation nearly knocked the shinobi off the bison. Thankfully he managed to right himself and levitate at the last instant. In matter of moments he rejoined them, alighting effortlessly upon the saddle once more, though looking no less pleased for the effort. He cried, "Are you trying to knock me off Appa or something? You've got to show me how to do that." Aang would not be dissuaded so easily. Naruto's expression turned somber. "I can't," he replied, "and even if I could, I still wouldn't teach you." "Oh, but why not? This attack is meant to be used as a last resort and nothing more," the blonde countered, eyes hidden beneath his roughened bangs. "If I were to unleash it on someone, say a firebender for example, it would damage them so badly they'd never be able to bend again. That is a fate I would wish on no man or woman, no matter how vile." He cracked an uneasy grin, then, a vain attempt to lighten the mood, "Hey, why the long faces, guys? I may be a monster, but at least I'm on your side, you know?" A somber silence followed those words, broken only by the wind in their hair or Aang's lack thereof and the passing of the clouds over and under their heads. Finally, someone decided to break it. "You're not a monster, Naruto." Naruto looked up, startled to find Katara's hand on his own. "Look, Katara, I appreciate the sentiment, but let's be honest here. I killed those firebenders back there, only sparing the prince on a whim. Hell, I enjoyed the killing. Do you hear me? It felt good. If that doesn't make me a monster, then I don't know what." "You are not," she repeated firmly, "a monster. What's wrong with you?" Naruto's lips parted in reply, but her other hand clamped over his mouth before he could speak. "Why would you even think such a thing after all you've said and done for us? Why, Aang is still alive, because of you. Our tribe wasn't destroyed by the Fire Nation because of you. Sokka and I are still standing here because of you. If protecting those you care for makes you a monster, then I'm one too." Something in those teary blue eyes of hers struck and forestalled him, preventing any argument on his part from pressing the issue any further. With that, Naruto relented. All right. He sighed, pushing a hand across her head. "By the gods, girl, don't start bawling on me now." Are you two done fighting?" Katara promptly flushed, pulled away, and went back to sewing Sokka's pants. "We weren't fighting, Aang." "Yeah," Sokka sighed good-naturedly. "Stop bugging her, airhead. You need to give girls space when they do their sewing." "What does me being a girl have to do with sewing?" There was a dangerous glint in Katara's eye now, an accusatory tone that, for those who knew her, would cause them to duck for cover. Sokka made the foolish and nearly fatal mistake of pressing the issue. "Simple," he replied, uncrossing his arms behind his head. "Girls are better at fixing pants than guys, and guys are better at hunting and fighting and stuff like that. It's just the natural order of things." Naruto and Aang simultaneously facepalmed. They recognized the verbal gaffe, but did Sokka? Nope. The young warrior of the water tribe realized his mistake far too late. "All done with your pants." His sister held up the half-stitched article of clothing and flung it in his face. "And look what a great job I did." "Wait. I was just kidding. I can't wear these." "Katara, please, relax, Sokka. Where we're going you won't need any pants. We're here." "Elephant koi." Naruto watched with bemusement as his fellow avatar rode the giant fish. It wasn't until something started to eat those massive koi that he began to worry. What if something happened to him? He wasn't exactly keen on saving the world by himself, and if Aang died he wouldn't reincarnate for quite some time. Not to mention he'd be reborn in the water tribe and any chance of him learning airbending would go out the window. A small chuckle fled his lips, unbidden, as Aang sped away from the gigantic creature, running across the water's surface through sheer speed alone before slamming into Sokka seconds thereafter. In the end, his efforts weren't even needed after all. What was that thing? Katara wondered. I don't know. Naruto already knew, probably an unagi. He stepped back toward the shallows whilst Katara went to check on Aang and her now considerably battered brother. They're native to these parts, after all. Well, unagi or not, I'd rather not stick around, Sokka decided, dusting himself off. Time to hit the road. What the heck? Everything happened so swiftly. One moment they were standing beneath the trees, listening to Sokka, the next, four shadows leapt from the branches and attacked them. In the time that it took Naruto to turn his head, Sokka, Katara, even Aang and Momo, were all subdued, bound and blindfolded, thrown down to the sands at his feet. Naruto was spared only because he'd been standing near the beach. It gave him just enough time to realize their attackers weren't men as he'd first suspected, but women. No, not even that, girls. Oh, Sokka is gonna be so pissed when he wakes up. Then the girls turned around to face Naruto. It was impossible to distinguish one from the other, he realized. What with the white makeup that covered their faces entirely, those red and black accents around their eyes lending their visages an almost regal appearance beyond the metal headdress and armored battle dress they wore. These strange female warriors looked at him for a long instant, before turning to face him as one, the combined movement causing their armored dresses to rustle, ever so slightly. It was alluring in a way. To say anything less would belittle their strength. Despite himself, the blonde felt the beginnings of a small smile work its way across his whiskered visage. I don't suppose we could sit down and talk about this over a cup of tea? Suddenly, and without warning, one of them attacked. Naive! Naruto simply swung his hand forward and punched with a fifth of his full strength, the sheer shockwave of the strike summoning forth a great gust, ripping her from her feet and hurtling her across the beach. He'd skid softly as she skidded across the sands in a tangle of arms and legs. He'd forgotten just how fragile the people of this land could be. Can't we just discuss this like civilized folk? He addressed the remaining three, hoping to refrain from further violence. It was not to be. They struck up their fans and moved to encircle him, but slowly, this time wary of this sudden and unseen burst of power. Their painted faces betrayed very little, perhaps the slightest twinge of concern for their injured kin, but nothing more. Look, this is pointless, Naruto continued. You're just going to end up on the ground like her. When the fate of their ally did not dissuade the remaining three warriors, the avatar of the gods took it upon himself to strike respect into their proud hearts. Not with close combat, of course. Even he might find himself at a bit of a disadvantage when holding back and facing three warriors like this in their native land, so, the knuckle-headed ninja did what came best to him. He improvised. 4 flicks of his fingers summoned forth a massive dragon of water, its golden eyes narrow and intent as it took stock of the 4 girls, their fallen comrade having only just reclaimed her footing. Interesting. So these girls were capable of withstanding him at a feeble fifth of his strength. One of the warriors saw fit to give voice to her all. What in the world? Swear you know jutsu, water dragon jutsu. Naruto exhaled softly and abruptly loosed the tentative leash he'd kept upon his jutsu. With a roar that would have put the Unagi to shame, it lunged forwards. 2 of the girls weren't swift enough to evade its watery maw. They found themselves swept away by the roaring tide as the beast impacted upon the beach. Their bodies were wrenched angrily against the trees, twisted to join the prone forms of his 3 friends, coughing and sputtering as the wall of water receded. 2 down, 2 to go. Resigning himself to battle, the blonde beckoned the remaining huntresses forward. Come on, girls. Let's get this over with. The pair exchanged a hesitant/tentative glance. Clearly they weren't accustomed to fighting someone who could actually fight back, certainly not someone of his caliber. But they had their duty and he had his. As one they pounced, their fans little more than a golden blur. He toyed with them for that brief instant, not too shabby amazed when one actually managed to scratch him with her fan, before a solid punch broke through his guard. Poof! Both girls balked as their opponent exploded into smoke, leaving a harmless log in his wake. What manner of sorcery was this? Where was he? Where had he gone? Suki, where did he? I don't know, Q beneath you. Her words ended in a frightened cry as a pair of hands burst through the sand, latching onto her friend's ankles. Before either of them could hope to react, their owner yanked down, hard. Q loosed a startled cry, her eyes scrunching shut as she prepared to be buried up to her neck. Those same eyes flew open, startled to find that while she had indeed been buried beneath the sands, it was only to her neck. It was a rather surreal experience, being unable to move anything above the neck, forced to look up at her leader. Q, I'm alright, the girl tried to shrug, but failed, I think. 3 down. Of course she's alright, a familiar voice chided. Contrary to popular belief, I'm not trying to harm you. Her companion whirled around as Naruto emerged from the earth beside them, covered in sand. Without so much as a glance in Suki's direction, he began to stride back toward his bound friends. He didn't have even a scratch on him. If anything, he looked amused by their efforts. Wait! Naruto stopped in his tracks, his face slowly appearing over his shoulder, as he curiously regarded his once fallen opponent. A look of irritation crossed his single eye as it regarded the recovering warrior behind him, her painted face narrow in a rictus of confusion. Did you want something? What did you do to her? She demanded to know. Naruto laughed and looked away again. Style, he admonished with a waggling finger. Headhunter jutsu, she won't be moving for a while though. He gave an amused grunt as Suki seized him from behind, her arms wrapping around his shoulders in a full Nelson and with surprising strength for someone of her size, wrenching him up off his feet. You got me! He laughed as he fell, toppling backwards to the sands. Clever girl. But with a hiss, he opened his mouth and spat, expelling a vicious stream of fire in the same instant that his face would have hit the sands. A flash of recognition flickered through Suki's mind just then. He'd used air to send one of her friends flying, water to take down two more, earth to immobilize Q, and now fire? Could he really be? But that's impossible. Not for me it isn't. Naruto never let up in his barrage, not once. Each blast pushed him another inch up into the air and caused the temperature to spike. This sudden expulsion of heat forced the Kyoshi warrior to loosen her hold upon the shinobi, or be burned, allowing him to wrench himself free and let loose a bone-jarring strike of his own design. Suki lost all semblance of breath as an armored shin crunched into her equally armored stomach and the later yielded. The blow wasn't crippling, but it did send her staggering away and give him time to rise. Time he gladly took. Naruto stood amidst the now glassy sand, his body still shimmering with heat, his hair rippling in the steam created by his last attack. His entire body seemed to ripple with barely suppressed energy. It was like gazing into the sun's light over long. Stare at it, and you'd only be burned. Enough, he declared, you've fought well, but that last blow's gonna to one hell of a bruise. I know you're hurting right now, and I'd rather you not exacerbate the injury, honestly. The girl expected her to fling herself at him in spite of her injuries and begin her offense anew. Imagine his surprise when Suki threw down her fans and fell to a knee. I knew it, she gasped, clutching at her side. You're the Avatar. Crap. He'd been too focused again. Me? Why me? He asked with surprise. I'm nothing special. Don't lie. Anger sharpened her tone. You used fire, earth, water and air. No other bender can do that. I suppose you wouldn't listen to me if I told you I wasn't a bender? Sincerity warmed her expression somewhat. So too did her misunderstanding. Look, you don't have to be shy about it. I can understand if you'd want to keep it a secret. But you don't. I'm not. Naruto groaned. Oh, for the love of help me out here, Aang. MMPH. The boy's words were muffled around his gag. Naruto's sweat dropped. The situation was rapidly unraveling. If this continued, if Suki told the others in her village, everyone would think he was the Avatar. A horrible realization dawned on him, one he never wanted to experience again, not if he could avoid it. Can I have a minute to untie my friends? Suki nodded. Naruto swiftly did just that, unbidding Katara and the others in the blink of an eye. Strategy meeting. He hissed. Now, what's wrong, Naruto? Katara asked. They think I'm the Avatar, that's what. Sokka adopted a thoughtful expression. And that's a problem? Naruto glared bloody red daggers at him. Look, I've got an idea. I object. Sokka frowned. You haven't even heard it yet, Naruto. I know you. And I know this is a bad idea. Look, Naruto might not be a bender, but at this rate, everyone will think he is, right? At everyone's nod, he pressed forward. Well, I say let them. Naruto immediately opened his mouth to veto that, but Sokka kept at it before the blonde or Aang could get a word in edgewise. Now wait just a minute, both of you. Hear me out, right now. Who is Prince Hothead hunting, Aang? You or Naruto? Who does he think is the Avatar? Katara tilted her head. She hadn't considered that question until this very moment. Aang? Do you know the answer? Naruto, the young Avatar, was beginning to see where this plan was going, and he didn't like it, not one bit. Naruto was of the same mind. It felt like he was stealing the poor boy's thunder. That just wasn't his style, nor did he enjoy wresting the claim to fame away from another. For Sokka to ask such a thing of him. No. He couldn't do it. It wasn't just his humility. He'd worked so hard to keep the Fire Nation from pestering him after his last death. And while he was already living a life on the run, he wasn't exactly keen on advertising his powers. I can't believe I'm saying this, but Sokka has a point. Katara. You too? It would give Aang all the time in the world to focus on his bending, the waterbender persisted. Besides, I've seen how much skill you have with the elements. Even though you're not a bender, you could still pass for the Avatar, easily. Why are you fighting us on this? Because I don't want to do it. Naruto argued. And you're forgetting about Aang. How does he feel about all this? 3 pairs of eyes focused upon the last airbender. Well, Aang, what do you think? Sokka and Katara asked almost simultaneously. Naruto shook his head rapidly, a silent plea for him to say no. Poor boy, he actually flinched. Does it really matter? Think of it this way, Sokka pointed out. We know for a fact that Naruto can handle almost anything the Fire Nation throws at him. We all know you're strong, Aang, but if something happened to you, well, I don't know what WHE do. The Avatar might be reborn, but there's only one you. Now that we have Naruto, we actually have an option. And while he is the Avatar, just think how much free time you'd have. It'd be even easier to master the elements. The Avatar seemed to consider this. Naruto growled, deep and low in his throat. Horrible idea. Terrible idea. I think it's a winner, Sokka reaffirmed. Says the boy who was beaten by a girl. Naruto hissed. That was a fluke. Right. Hey, do you want to save the world or not? That's low, Aang groaned. You guys, I have a bad feeling about this. But if it helps with my training, let's do it. Sokka turned to his sister. I would like to state for the record that those words did not come out of my mouth. Naruto was still muttering to himself when he stalked back to Suki, every fiber of his being railed against this. But he could see the need for it, as much as he might loathe it sometimes. Choices like this had been made, regardless of whether he liked them or not. With this in mind, he steeled himself to speak. What was all that about? She asked. Just a discussion of how long we intend to stay, the blonde lied. Still, you'd best gather your elders. I have a message for them. And what might that be? A delicate brow quirked in questioning. Tell them that the Avatar has returned. The word traveled like wildfire. The Avatar had returned, and he was upon Kyoshi. One would think it ironic that hearsay could move so swiftly. But it did. Word of mouth passing from a young girl to that of a fisherman on the docks of Kyoshi, from said fisherman to that of an Earth Kingdom trader, work, then a Fire Nation cook, until at long last, those words reached the ears of a certain prince. For a moment, said Firebender could barely believe his luck. Here he had sat down to dinner, resolved to another sleepless night. What? Zuko lurched up from the dinner table, the steaming salmon on his plate now forgotten. The Avatar is on Kyoshi Island? Foolish words, spoken in anger and haste. Helmsman, change course at once. Unbeknownst to him, another became aware of that location as well. 1 week later, Naruto grunted as he parried his opponent's blow. Using the same leverage against her to negate the force of her throw, she struggled back, trying to use his own strength against him. But his stance proved simply too solid for her to breach. Likewise, she proved too fluid to grasp without serious effort on his part. Effort he wasn't willing to expend just yet. They stood there, a long moment, staring one another down, refusing to yield, to give ground, to back down, to yield. Finally, at an unseen command, they broke apart. Your stance is getting better. The ex-shinobi found himself commending Suki. I wish you'd stop holding back, she sighed, straightening and closing her fan. Hey, if I did that, it wouldn't be any fun. Was it just his imagination, or was that a flush beneath the face paint? He stood in a radically altered version of the Kyoshi battle dress, contoured to fit his male physique. Minus the white face paint, of course. Tradition or not, he simply refused to go through that again. It had been hilarious to see Sokka wearing it yesterday. The poor boy didn't have any skill with the needle, and as such, had been forced to wear something similar to what his sparring partner wore. Before an unseen, Naruto, my Lord Avatar. Naruto looked up from his sparring session with Suki, momentarily discomfited by that title. Sokka's plan was working well. Everyone thought he was the Avatar, not Aang. It made sense from a certain point. While he drew attention, the young airbender could learn all the bending he required without the undue attention of being hunted by the Fire Nation. That didn't mean he had to like it, though. Far from it, he loathed this idea. The idea of taking credit for someone else had never sat well with him. Having actual power had done little to temper that distaste. Nearly a full week had passed since their arrival in Kyushu. Ironically, he had been the one to argue for their extended stay. He didn't know if it was Suki, or the something else. He simply felt drawn here. But what was it? Suki was a nice girl after all, he supposed. She'd warmed to him considerably during the last 7 days, and although he remained loath to admit it, he did enjoy their spars, especially Stop. That way lay ruin. Shaking himself from those treacherous thoughts, Naruto rose. wiped the sweat from his brow, and turned to face the messenger standing in the door. Yes, what is it? Fire Nation troops have landed in Kyoshi. The blonde nearly facepalmed at the news. So much for this peace and quiet. Not Zuko again. Zuko? Suki asked as he slipped his armor on. He's just some pesky prince I beat in the South Pole, Naruto replied, donning his jacket. Don't worry about it. In the meantime, I need you to get Aang and the others. We may need to bug out if things get heated in any case. But, Suki, I won't endanger your island any longer than I already have. A small pang twisted at his heart as he said this. In the lone week that they'd spent here, he'd actually felt normal. To leave that behind and voyage out into the unknown again was strangely disheartening. It was selfish of me to make everyone stay here this long. I've put you all in danger because of that. What, you don't think I can handle a few Fire Nation troops? She challenged as he slipped on the last of his armor. No, I understand that you're a warrior, but firebenders are way out of your league. So you just don't trust me, then? A pain note entered her tone. Her painted face seemed strangely sad somehow. Damn it, warrior girl, why won't you listen? Her hand closed around his wrist, holding him fast. Yes, I'm a warrior, she replied, her voice the barest whisper. Something soft touched his whiskered visage an instant later. But I'm also a girl. Naruto blinked, touching a hand to his cheek, opened his mouth to speak. But it was already too late. Suki, she was gone, leaving him with his innermost thoughts. Where the hell had that come from? Strange creatures, women, truly. He crossed the streets with swift strides, reaching the docks almost in no time at all. Oddly enough, he didn't encounter any firebenders. That was odd in and of itself. The closer he came to the docks, the more certain he became. They were waiting for him there. The barge didn't even lower its ramp until he was a few feet away. Nevertheless, he prepared himself for battle. All right, Prince Hothead, he growled, flexing his fingers. Are you ready for round 2? I'd call it round 1. The hell dash? Naruto was expecting Zuko to step off that ship and face him. Not a girl, certainly not someone his age. Sheesh, first Suki and those Kyoshi warriors and now this? Why did he seem to be facing the opposite sex as of late? Was fate messing with him or something? It must be. So he stood there and watched wary as this newcomer surveyed her surroundings. There was something dangerous about her. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. Perhaps it was her aura, or maybe it was the eyes. In any case, Uzumaki Naruto, avatar of the gods, found himself just a touch uncomfortable. So, this is Kyoshi Island, the girl murmured to herself as she disembarked. It seems father was right to plant that spy on Zuzu's ship after all. And now I've beaten him to the punch. How wonderful. She extended her slim shoulder in a shrug. Honestly, what more could a girl ask for? Suddenly wary, Naruto edged a foot forward. This girl wasn't like the others he'd fought. You're not Zuko. The girl saw him and smiled then. It was a soft, deadly, dangerous thing, that smile. Well, what do we have here? She chuckled. You mean to say you're the avatar that I've heard so much about? Her gaze roamed across his lightly armored body with intrigue, a spark of interest shining in those dark orbs of hers. You certainly are handsome, I'll give you that. But you should be humbled. A hand rose in a fierce flourish of blue flame. You have the honor of addressing Azula, princess of the Fire Nation. I do hope you've prepared yourself. For? Why, for the fight of your life, of course. Azula said it as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. You didn't think I rushed here ahead of my brother just to have tea now, did you? Despite himself and all his power, Naruto actually blanched behind his guard. Ah, Christ. Then his vision swelled with azure fire. What's wrong, Avatar? Azula laughed arrogantly as the blonde backpedaled steadily in retreat. Afraid of fire? You should be. Now hold still, and let you burn me? I think not, Fire Girl. Naruto stubbornly resisted the urge to give in to his own anger and attack, refused to play to his enemy's strategy. Instead he continued to bob and weave, leading the proud princess on a winding path further and further away from the village. Avatar or not, he wasn't willing to risk innocence just for the sake of his own glory. But this was swiftly becoming tedious. He'd thought to lead Azula and her troops away from the village. In that at least, he'd been partially successful. Azula had chased after him like a moth to flame, leaving her troops to remain behind. Even now he could see the fires beginning to burn in Kyoshi, tongues of ember creeping through those thatch roofs, their rosy hues mingling with that of the setting sun. He silently prayed Suki had made it to Aang and the others in time, that they'd be able to handle themselves. Of course they would. They had Suki and the Kyoshi warriors backing them up after all, and it wasn't as though they couldn't handle a few firebenders, he hoped. But that left him dealing with the princess alone. He was swiftly beginning to regret that decision. Azula wasn't a damn thing like her brother. These strikes of hers were precise and perfect, hardly a flaw to be seen amidst them, and that was without the firebending. Those grand sweeps of fire, those azure flames, were proving a great deal warmer than he would have liked. A mere trifle to deal with at full strength, but if he were to do that here, he'd wreck the entire island, perhaps even destroy it altogether. Still, they came closer and closer, those blows did. With each instant he tarried, singing hairs and leaving burns, albeit small ones, upon his face. Injuries he was certain would take days to heal, days, instead of seconds. It was one of the few perks he'd forfeited by absorbing the Jubi. For all the incredibly power he'd gained, all the awesome abilities of Sharingan, Rinnegan, and mastery over all the elements of Shinobi, there had been one mortal drawback, one flaw to all the perfection he'd gained. Naruto couldn't regenerate, at the very least, not instantaneously as he once had, not anymore. In the beginning, he'd healed relatively swiftly, but, with each passing death, his healing had grown slower and slower. Now, he felt every near miss, every burn that seared itself into his visage, and he endured. Never once did he strike back, ever retreating, always on the defense, until he was certain, absolutely certain, that he'd escaped the blast zone, given Kyoshi village and an acceptable radius of distance. Finally, enough was enough. Mukeke's, his hand shot forth to meet Azula's. The first direct confrontation since she tried to attack him back in the village. Flame met a headwind, and the former yielded, snuffed out like a candle in the wind. Do excuse the pun. A heartbeat later, all that remained was the faintest wisp of steam curling outward from her first. The princess frowned, but quickly regained her confidence when the blonde drew back, and adopted a familiar stance. He was going to fight firebending with firebending, then? Interesting. And were those black flames forming around his fists? Truly, this young man continued to astound by Agni. When he moved, she barely saw him. One moment he was standing across from her, arms raised. The next his fist slammed into her cheek, sending her neck, followed by the rest of her body, snapping to the side. The sheer force of that single punch launched Azula halfway across the plain. With a surprised grunt, the light-skinned princess went flying down the training ground, a trail of dark blood following her body through the falling debris. Naruto, breath caught in his throat, hitching as he struggled and failed to suppress a laugh. He watched as Azula's limp body slammed against the stones as once gravity took hold of her, her skin skidding across the ground as the momentum continued to drag her over the earth. Her feet were suddenly free from the ground as a burst of fire from palms carried her over the sun-soaked terrain, stopping her just short of smashing into a nearby boulder. Just as Naruto had suspected, a roundhouse blow in his restrained form that would have floored someone like Zuko had only left the girl slightly out of breath, dizzy perhaps, but still very much in the fight, not to mention pissed. By the gods, I really need to stop holding back against these firebenders, they're just too tenacious. So you've finally decided to fight back? Azula didn't even bother to keep the smile from her face as she picked herself up. It's about time. Naruto risked a glance for his surroundings. Kyoshi could be seen on the shoreline. Only a few miles away now, it would have to do. Something like that, yes, he replied, quietly cursing himself for not finishing the little Hellcat when he had the chance. We've retreated to an acceptable distance, in any case. Oh? A delicate brow arched in benign amusement. And here I thought you were running away. But you were trying to save the village, weren't you? How quaint, she chuckled then. It sounded oddly girlish, emerging from the mouth of a hardened killer such as herself. Well played, Avatar. Her congratulations dripped with derision. Well played indeed. But it doesn't matter, not really. My men are the best of the best. If those peace-loving Kyoshi warriors refuse to see reason and surrender, they'll simply burn your precious village to the ground, of course. If you surrendered yourself, I could always convince them to put the fires out. Is that so? It is. The blonde's smugness infuriated her. But Azula refused to let it show. So what do you say, Avatar? If you come quietly, I might be able to put in a good word for you with Fire Lord Ozai. Oh, isn't that kind of you? Naruto's words dripped with false sweetness. And to what do I owe this kindness? To his surprise, Azula actually flushed. Is it so wrong for me to be kind to a potential captive? On so many levels, Naruto's deadpan was barely concealed. Well, in that case, I hope you enjoy watching your precious village burn. Actually, You might want to take another look. The blonde raised a long finger and pointed. I don't think your boys will be burning anything anytime soon. Against her better judgment, Azula did just that. What she saw there astounded her. There, rising in the distance, was some sort of sea serpent. There could be no other word for the giant Anagi. And then, to her dismay, it actually spewed water from its open maw, dousing the burning village within the blink on an eye. Its duty done, and the flames extinguished. The Anagi tossed back its head and loosed a final triumphant cry before disappearing back into the ocean's depths. Had one gazed upon its head, they might have seen a certain airbender leap away mere moments before it returned to the abyss. But Azula did not see. She only saw that her plans had been thwarted, felt her tenuous grasp on the situation slipping away. But how? She spluttered. You know, that's the exact same look Zuko wore earlier. Naruto's grin grew another inch. Thanks to Aang, now I am free to fight you without anything holding me back. But before I kick your ass, I have one last question. Whatever did happen to old Prince Hothead? I was certain he'd be the one to find me first. You mean my fool of a brother? Azula scoffed, ignoring the flicker of shock that passed through the blonde's visage. I'm not certain. When my spy reported you'd crippled his engines, I'd assumed he'd finally given up once and for all. In any case, your little delay gave me all the time I needed to get here beforehand. And if he does somehow find his way here, I'll simply comply with the Fire Lord's demands and lock him away. Barring that, I'll kill him myself. We've no use for that failure of a prince. At that thought, she frowned. Why are you so concerned for him, anyway? Just idle curiosity, I suppose. Something in the Avatar's tone suggested otherwise, and Azula knew. She'd struck a nerve. You really are ruthless, ain't ya? His words were cold, deadly, willing to sacrifice anything in the name of duty, even your own brother. Once, that would have disgusted me. It probably still does, but I've got to admit, that's some frightful determination there. If you weren't my enemy, I'd respect you for it. Azula smiled tightly and tucked her stray hair back into place. The picture of perfection once more. Why, thank you, she replied. I must admit, you've done a fairly decent job of mucking up my plans thus far. It's not all that often I have to get my hands dirty. It felt strange to be complimented by her adversary. Many of her enemies were either too arrogant to admit their own flaws, or simply too afraid of facing her wrath to loosen their tongues. That this Avatar had done so to be respected by her enemy, it made her curious. Just who was this young man? I would very much like to know your name, Avatar. The words escaped her before she could take them back, her initial interest getting the better of her. For the first time since they'd met, the blonde actually looked to be at a loss for words, if only for a moment. Narot, he supplied at last. Uzumaki Naruto. I'll be sure to remember it. Shall we continue then? Naruto resumed his stance once, but there was something off about it. His foot was too far forward, and his arms were spread wide. Didn't he see he was full of openings? But if he was hoping to make her hesitate, he had another thing coming. Azula never backed down from any challenge. We shall! Their fists met in small explosions of azure and onyx, colliding over and over again, black and blue fires rippling outward in every direction to scar the landscape, scalding neither, to her dismay. Azula actually found her flames being overwhelmed by those tongues of dark ether, the Avatar's mysterious black flames creeping impossibly forward to obliterate her own. She had an awful feeling something terrible would happen should this inferno find purchase on her skin. Unthinking, the Fire Princess lashed out again, intent upon incinerating him on the spot before those eerie embers could touch her. Nope. Azula frowned as the blonde inhaled, and her flames simply died. Impossible. He'd sucked the oxygen out of her attack. Even as she realized this, the faux Avatar was in motion, flinging a hand forward, his palms closing around her wrist, locking down with enough force to shatter bone. Azula cried out and flung 2 fingers toward, a bolt of jagged lightning leaping from her fingertips. The blonde didn't even bother to release her. He just dipped one hand down, caught the bolt, and redirected it with a single hand, sending her penultimate technique hurtling off into the distance. In that same instant, she opened her mouth and spat. Whoosh! It was with a small pang of regret that she spewed a curtain of flame right at his face and burned his head to ashes. The vice on her wrist slackened, and his body toppled away. Despite all she'd said, she'd hoped to avoid killing him. Such a shame. Now they'd have to search for him all over again. Poof! Naruto's body vanished in a plume of smoke, leaving only dust behind. Azula blinked, her mouth opening in a small round O of shocked surprise, Was this what happened to the Avatar's body when he died? Where was he? Surely the Avatar didn't just poof away like that when he died? What in the name of Agni? Dynamic entry! Came Naruto's ridiculous battle cry, and much like he did Might Guy had done to countless opponents in the past, he landed a perfect kick to Azel's face. She barely had enough time to register the blow before she was sent crashing into a boulder, quickly falling into a pile of crumbled limbs. Scarce had she fallen than he was upon her, fingers wrapping around her throat, slamming her body back into the boulder's spine with enough force to leave an Azula-sized indentation in the stone. You asked me, am I afraid of fire? The words were little more than a hiss as he held her there, leering down at her with eyes of angry, rippling violet. No, little girl, but you should be afraid of me. What are you? Naruto uttered 2 words then, 2 simple words, and yet they unleashed hell upon the princess. Shinra Tensei, the island of Kyoshi erupted. Mud was the lifeblood of Mother Earth, rippling and roiling around their feet, gushing forth from the massive wound Naruto had carved into her flesh. There could be no describing the force that drove Azula down, deep into the ground's embrace, only that this massive, unseen push did, reducing her armor to ash and snapping a rib like it was glass. What strength! What power! She'd been overwhelmed in an instant, made as helpless as an errant, disobedient child. She could taste the blood in her mouth, barely see the light of day. Was it her hair, torn free from her bun, that shaded her vision so? Or was she dying, her life leeching away despite all her best efforts to grasp that feeble thread? A booted foot struck her stomach, driving her deeper still. Sure enough, the Avatar stood there untouched, his foot planted firmly in her stomach, pinning her to the soil. What are you? I am the hope of this world, the blonde replied, violet eyes leering down at her. I am the answer to all living things that cry out for peace. I am protector of the innocent. I am the light in the darkness. I am truth, ally to good. Nightmare to you, now say it. This is your last chance. Say you're sorry. Apologize for what you've done. I'm sorry. The words tasted like bile in her mouth. She hated every instant of it. Naruto took his foot off before looking at the princess for what felt like a small eternity. Was it her? Or were those eyes violet? All of a sudden, no, you're not yet, but you will be someday. He slammed his heel back down on the girl's stomach yet again, this time with gusto, causing her to roll over and dry heave. Naruto took that opportunity to grab hold of her head and slammed it into the ground, causing a crack to appear in the earth. A fissure spreading half the width of Kyoshi Island. That was all it took. A single head slam at full strength and the princess of the Fire Nation died. Her last thought was not of home, nor was it of family before the sweet blackness took her. It wasn't even of how she'd been beaten, although her impending death rankled her. It was knowing that there was someone out there, someone incredibly strong, who respected her, not for her title, or even her bending, but for the single, mindless determination that drove her. The desire to be the best, to stand above everyone, it was the only thing that drove her. Beneath the violence and the sadism and the cruelty, she simply wanted to prove that, above all, she was the best, and the only one who respected her for that had just killed her. How twisted. With that, Azula of the Fire Nation breathed her last. Naruto stared down at the prone princess for a long moment, considering he should just leave her, let her stay dead, but he'd seen the potential for goodness in her, no matter how slim, and for all the cruel things he'd done over the years, he just couldn't let her stay dead, not with a clear conscience. Then, his mind made up, he opened his eyes, Rinnegan flaring. It was an easy matter to call her soul back to her body, to heal her wounds, repairing the massive internal damage, knitting her spine and ribs back together with careful applications of chakra. Being an avatar of the gods had its privileges. After all, his regenerations might be all but hampered, yet he could now tend and mend injuries that would have made even Sakura and Tsunade balk. Oh, the bitter irony of it all. Finally, when he was certain his revived patient would live to see a second sunrise, he ceased his ministrations. Slinging over his shoulder, he activated the Horatian seal he planted on Katatra and popped back into existence in Kyoshi village. It was a little disorienting using his father's jutsu again after all these years, but it saved him precious time and stamina. It also landed him right in the middle of a fierce fight between Aang, Katara, Sokka, the Kyoshi warriors, and the remaining firebenders. Chaos wouldn't even begin to describe what was happening here. Apparently at some point during his one-sided battle with Azula, Zuko had finfully made landfall. It was his forces, hardly those of the princess, who were laying waste to the village now, rather difficult when one considered everything was still soaked by the Unagi's water. Naruto! When did you get Dash? He dimly registered Katara's voice in the back of his mind as he ducked under a fireball using the Rinne Tensei no Jutsu had left him far more drained than he would have liked, but he still had more than enough juice to spatter a few Fire Nation soldiers. But he had neither the time nor the patience to deal with them. Enough! His voice cracked like thunder, commanding silence and flooring everyone present, ally and enemy included. You idiots are going to drop your weapons now or be disemboweled where you stand. I have had enough of this shit for one day. With the chaos of battle momentarily abated, both sides were able to get a good look at one another, including that of a certain prince. Zuko started sputtering the moment he laid eyes on him. Why you? Me. Naruto stepped forward, grabbed the scarred youth by the scruff of the neck, and headbutted the poor prince with enough force to knock him a state similar to that of his sister, Sweet Dreams, Hothead. With his enemy finally silenced, the blonde grunted and glared at the assembled firebenders. Which one of you meatbags is in charge of the princess here? He growled, holding up Azula. Tentatively, a bearded gentleman raised his hand. Naruto summarily chucked Azula's unconscious body at the man. The poor fellow barely managed to catch his princess before she hit the ground. Then, without pause or preamble, he turned to address the other firebenders. ROH! He bellowed. Get your ass out here! Now! There was a silence as the men glanced at one another. Finally they parted, revealing a rather portly-looking man in Fire Nation garb and armor. Despite his own ire, Naruto nearly guffawed. The years had indeed been kind to the general. He was a great deal heavier than Naruto remembered, not to mention older, but still very much in good health. Yes, time had been exceptionally kind indeed. You don't have to shout, Naruto, he sighed, brushing at his sleeve. Who the heck is that? Sokka wondered. Aang shrugged. Beats me. Katara had more practical matters on her mind, such as the situation unfolding before her very eyes. Naruto was giving orders to firebenders. And they were obeying him? But how? Why? She wasn't entirely certain how she felt about that. Naruto had struck her as many things during his time in the South Pole. A friend, guardian, perhaps even something more than both of those, but never, in her wildest dreams, had she imagined him to have ties with the Fire Nation, not a once. I see you've taken good care of my niece and nephew, the old general mused, taking in Zuko and Azula's sorry state. Don't get your beard in a bunch. The godly avatar shook his head. I just roughed them up a bit. They're only alive because of our friendship. Which reminds me, you'd better get going. He turned his head to indicate the opposite fleet of ships, still in disarray with defeat of their commander. But it wouldn't last, and they both knew it. Your precious little niece here intended to capture the two of you, or worse. I'd suggest you beat it skedaddle before you have half the nation on your backs. Oh, and you might want to check your crew for a spy as well. My, that is interesting. Iroh stroked at his beard. I had no idea my brother had planted someone on board our ship, let alone sent Azula after us. Nah, she took the initiative on her own, Naruto replied. Gave me a bit of a fight too. If you hadn't shown me that technique of yours, she might have done more than singe a few hairs. Ha! The Dragon of the West laughed at that, deep and loud from his belly. It was not the laugh of a cruel Fire Nation general, Katara mused. This man actually seemed kind? We'll have to discuss your exploits over tea sometime, Iroh was saying, accepting Zuko from Naruto as she came back to herself. Provided my nephew isn't trying to kill you, of course, Avatar. Naruto barely kept a lid on his emotions in that instant. Somehow, someway, his old friend knew what they were up to, and yet instead of revealing the truth, bringing the lies crashing down around their ears as he could have done, he merely winked. Naruto forced a laugh of his own, silently thanking the gods his old friend was on their side. Ha! So you wanna kick my ass in Pai Sho again? He snapped back, but the words were lacking in rancor. No fair. You know I suck at that game. Muttering to himself, he turned to face Azula's men. Now listen, and listen good. I'm only going to say this once. You and all of your men are going to take Princess Hothead here. Get back on your ships, set sail, or I'm going to make each of you run 15,000 laps around the island, on your hands. His eyes blazed warningly, promising pain to any and all who dared challenge his command. Never in all her life did Katara think to see the men and women of the Fire Nation army, the strongest and mightiest military that this side of the planet has ever seen, cry like babies when they heard what came out of Naruto's mouth. "Why, yes, sir. The blonde declared, I am going to bed. I'm getting too goddamned old for this shit." I never paused to consider the consequences of that fight, the ramifications. There simply wasn't any time to dwell upon it. Kyoshi was saved, but our time there was done. Although we'd defeated the Fire Nation and forced them away from the island, I knew that our very presence would attract unwanted attention, and so we departed. First thing the next morning, I barely even had time to say goodbye to Suki, strong girl, that one. I could tell that she wanted to come with us, but she knew her duty lay with her people, to help them rebuild and garrison themselves against the threat. So we departed, leaving her behind, or so I thought. Turns out Kyoshi Warrior's rival shinobi in terms of stealth. By the time we realized she'd stowed away under one of the tarps, we were already halfway to the nearest settlement. That certainly made things amusing when the others discovered her. Our travels were little more than a blur after that. Even the Earth city of Omashu, now that was an interesting experience. I've never met someone craftier than this bummy fellow. His strategies put Shikamaru to shame in every sense of the word. The old king saw right through our little ruse. He knew Aang was the avatar of the elements, while I was not. In a way, I was almost grateful for it. Someone other than the four of us now knew the truth. But damn, was he crazy. To think that someone so old could be so off their rocker. But it wasn't until we happened upon an occupied Earth Kingdom village that things became interesting again. Were it not for a young earthbender named Haru, I wouldn't have had the chance to indulgence in what I'd still consider the ultimate prank of all time. My temper wouldn't have proved beneficial to our cause. Fire is difficult to control, eh? His words were little more than a hiss, fingers tightening inexorably around the man's throat. Funny you should mention that. You know what is even harder to control? My temper, and right now, you're making me very angry, old man. Sapphire eyes flashed dangerously, promising pain. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry. The fool had made the massive mistake of extorting a harmless woman and her son, Haru, for more tax money in his presence, subtly threatening to accidentally lose control of his bending and down there store, much to everyone's dismay. Needless to say, Naruto hadn't taken very kindly to that. "You, how dare you do this to me?" The firebender grunted. "Do you know who I am?" "No, and I don't much care," Naruto replied, drawing back his fist, a subtle swirl of flames circling in his own fist. "Now, would you kindly get the hell out?" Snarling, he flung the firebender backwards and out of the shop and spat, enveloping him in flame. It didn't so much kill as it did burn, sending him and his guards shrieking away as they struggled to put out the blaze Naruto had started on their behinds. "And don't come back." There was a moment of quiet as their shrieks died away into the distance, then everyone burst out into laughter and guffaws. "Priceless!" Suki burst out between giggles. "That was amazing!" Haru grinned. "I had no idea you were a bender. Man, that was priceless!" Sokka agreed with a cackle. "I guess you could say they really got burned on that deal, huh?" "Huh! Get it? They're firebenders, and they got burned." Silence. "What, does no one get the joke?" he complained, sullen. "I thought it was pretty good." "Stick to sarcasm, Sokka," Katara chided with a smile. "Still, that was better than what I had planned, Naruto." As always, the blonde never ceased to amaze, or barring that, outright astound. Now that the little snafu with the Fire Nation was temporarily behind them, she was reminded once more why she'd come to admire the blonde, and that he and Aang were alike. Naruto was never the sort to stand for corruption or injustice. He didn't care what the consequences were, he simply acted. Suki was of a similar mind. She would have been the one to attack if Naruto hadn't done something. "Thank you," Haru's mother spoke up suddenly, garnering everyone's attention with her words. "It has been so long since someone stood up for us." "No one?" Suki seemed to speak for everyone when she said this. "Surely someone's tried to do something. Anything?" A sinister pall fell over the group, as one day began to realize just how much these people were chafing beneath the Fire Nation occupation. "No," the woman shook her head, confirming their worst fears, "not since Haru's father and the other earthbenders were taken to the prison." Naruto's ears twitched. The beginnings of a smile started to form on that whiskered visage. "Did you say prison?" "Why yes, he and the other earthbenders were taken there about 5 years ago." "Impossibly," Naruto's grin grew. Sokka was the first to recognize it. "Oh no." "Oh," Aang blanched. Katara seconded the sentiment. I know that look. What? Suki looked from Katara to Aang, even to Sokka. What's wrong? Why is he smiling? I'm afraid I don't understand what's going on. Naruto chose to ignore those words. Guys, I know what we're going to do today. The rest of Team Avatar gulped. Even Suki had a bad feeling about this. She had no idea what was coming next. Jailbreak. A/N. And there you have it. Naruto stomped on Azula hard, only to bring her back perhaps out of pity? It remains to be seen whether or not that'll have any real effect on the story. Azula's a broken girl more or less. Her views on life are really rather twisted, and Suki's decided to tag along for the ride. Events are already beginning to change rapidly, perhaps for the better, perhaps not. With all this chaos raging around, who knows what may happen next? As fun as the events in Omashu were, I've decided to skip them this time around for the sake of the plot. Anywho, I worked extremely hard on this one, so I hope to hear what you think. Pairing is up in the air. You decide. And on a final note, thank you to everyone offering emotional support in regard to my health woes. It's greatly appreciated. An awful lot is going to change in this story soon. Look forward to an epic prank next chapter provided my health holds out. So in the immortal words of Atlas, review would you kindly? And of course, enjoy the preview. So basically the plan is to invade this prison and kick some Fire Nation ass. No? Naruto. The blonde sighed as Katara whacked him on the shoulder, the only part of him she could reach. Sorry, forgot about the swearing. Oh, leave him be. Suki shook her head. He's obviously set on this. And it's not like we can leave those people trapped. I agree. Aang nodded. Sounds fun, right? This not fun. Sokka cried. This is the opposite of fun? Why aren't you listening, Aang? But I think it's fun. Darn it, Naruto, you've doomed us all. In that instant, the shinobi's grin could have put Lucifer himself to shame. Suki gulped. Naruto. You're seriously starting to scare me right now. The blonde's grin only grew. Good. So here's the plan to invade the prison and kick some Fire Nation ass. Naruto began sometime later. I'm only going to explain this once, so listen, and listen well. He'd gathered them all together in a nearby barn, the 8 of them. Himself, Katara, Suki, Sokka, Aang, Appa, Momo, and last but certainly not least, Haru. Night was falling on the village. Tomorrow they would enact this gloriously devious strategy to free Haru's father and all the benders from Fire Nation Conral. Now, first, we scare the hell out of the little bitches. Naruto. The blonde sighed as Katara whacked him on the shoulder, the only part of him she could reach. Sorry, forgot about the swearing. Oh, leave him be, Katara. Suki paused from stroking Appa's chin to shake her head. He's obviously set on this. And it's not like we can leave those people trapped. Naruto opened his mouth to agree. That was when he saw the moonlight striking her face. She turned away from him, returning her attention to Appa. And for this, he was suddenly intensely grateful. It means she didn't catch him staring. She really did look different without her Kyoshi warrior makeup. Like a normal girl, even. Although she'd yet to change out of her armor, he could still see that she was a true beauty and would only grow with age. Unbidden, the memory of her kiss came roaring back, filling his face with fire. Down, boy! Is there something on my face? The young warrior became aware of his attention and touched a hand to her cheek. Naruto nearly swooned before getting himself back under control, just barely. He'd gone without the fairer sex for so long he'd almost forgotten what it was like. And was it just him, or did he feel a touch of killer intent from Katara? No, he shook his head rapidly, dismissing Suki's words. It's nothing. Oh, she seemed slightly crestfallen at that. I see. I agree. Aang nodded, utterly oblivious to the scene or the tension. Sounds fun, right? Haru blinked. Fun? Don't listen to him. Sokka cried. This is not fun. This is the opposite of fun. Why aren't you listening, Aang? But I think it's fun. Darn it, Naruto, you've doomed us all. In that instant, the shinobi shook off his sorrow and grinned. That smile could have put a certain spirit to shame. No, I've doomed the enemy. Suki gulped. Naruto. You're seriously starting to scare me right now. The blonde's grin only grew. Good, he chuckled. Then it'll terrify the Fire Nation. Now here's the plan. He told them as much. His glorious idea to rescue the prisoners and prank the hell out their Fire Nation's wardens. There was a silence then. More than a few jaws hung agape at what the blonde had just told them. If he hadn't been the avatar of the gods, such a thing wouldn't have been feasible. Even now, his strange suggestion strained the limits of their credulity. Suki and Haru remained particularly baffled. Granted, they had not known the shinobi all that long, but this was ridiculous. You, sir, are a mad genius. Katara shook her head in disbelief, further inflaming their confusion. Disguising ourselves as Fire Nation? I'm surprised Sokka didn't think of that. Hey, I can't come up with all the plans, the warrior replied, begrudgingly recognizing the simple brilliance of Naruto's scheme. Guess I'm not the only tactician here, aren't I? Naruto grinned, slapping his foster brother on the back. Honestly though, I think that title of mad genius should be reserved for Bumi. Aang burst into hysterics at that one. But how are you going to get on board without alerting them? I already told you, I'm not. Naruto's grin grew. Azula is. His gaze slid to Haru. She'll be escorting in a treasonous earthbender. Now it was Haru's turn to object. I haven't known you all that long, but this doesn't make any sense. How are we going to get the princess of the Fire Nation by the earth? Before he could finish, the blonde snorted and slapped both hands together, summoning up a massive plume of smoke, hence the exclamation. A series of hacking coughs arose from the barn, and when the plume dissipated, Team Avatar found themselves treated to an inexplicable sight. Naruto was gone. Princess Azula stood in his place. Hello, cretins, she sneered. Miss me? What in the dash? Their reaction time was nothing short of spectacular. Azula instantly found herself ensorcelled within a wall of earth and ice, with Sokka's boomerang and Suki's fan at her throat. An was the only one who held back, although whether it was out of hesitation or his own reluctance to kill remained to be seen. What have you done with Naruto? Katara demanded to know. Where is he? What did you do to him? Where did you take him? Oh, places. The princess's smile never faltered in the face of the waterbender's fury. Those eerie golden orbs drifting slightly shut, things, you know, that sort of thing. Answer me. Why, he's right here, of course. When next they opened, those eyes were a startling shade of blue. Naruto's voice issuing forth from Azula's mouth a moment later. Hee, it's only me. Sorry about that. I couldn't resist pulling your legs. I just look like her, don't I? A simple shrug of those slender shoulders swiftly shattered the prison Katara and Haru had encased him in, shooting shards of dirt and broken earth erupting outwards with effortless ease. By the time the dust had cleared, Naruto was with them once more. Wow, Aang blinked. Wish I could do that. Katara wasn't so easy to convince. Wait a second, how do we know you're the real Naruto? A long-suffering sigh left his lips. Alright then, only I could know this. The waterbender stiffened. He wouldn't dare. Katara, when you were only 6 years old you once told me you wanted to marry someone. That someone was... Naruto's mouth was quickly covered by a deeply flushing Katara. You promised not to talk about that. Naruto! She hissed out. Turning her head slightly she found Nai but everyone staring back at her with confused expressions. Her flush grew even redder. Thankfully, Naruto chose that moment to break the silence. Oh, and Sokka, you wet the bed until you were 10. Do you believe me now? The hysteria that followed as well as the grateful giggle from Katara was utterly priceless. Haru actually snickered. You did what? Not cool, man. Sokka whined. Not cool. Naruto? Suki gawped, stepping forward. I'm afraid I don't understand. How did you turn into that girl? Yes, Haru agreed. Could you please explain, Sir Avatar? The blonde merely laughed, and changed back into Azula again. Henge, the now transformed Naruto smiled softly as he observed a manicured hand. It was eerie, Suki thought, by the gods themselves. He even sounded like that crazy girl. It's a fascinating ability. To tell the truth, useful, too. I've had centuries to master its greatest intricacies. I can stay like this for at least a week if I don't use any of my major techniques. Used to be I could only transform into someone I knew, but now? Now I can become almost anyone. Of course I did think about becoming the royal flaming asshole himself. Fire Lord Ozai anyone? But where's the fun in that, I say? Suki frowned. You think this is fun? Of course I do, Naruto grinned, popping back into his normal body. It's been ages since I've pranked the Fire Nation. What better way to do it than with their own princess? I got a good look at her mannerisms when we fought. With a bit of practice, I'm certain I can fool them. From there, it's just a matter of pranking the hell out of the warden and his men. Not to mention inspiring the earthbenders to rise up and fight their oppressor as true warriors should. It'll be cake. It still doesn't change the fact that you're taking an awful risk, she pressed. You're one of our strongest fighters, remember? If we lose you, then we risk losing the war itself. She didn't see Aang bristle in the corner of her eye. For a moment Naruto thought the boy was going to reveal his status. A curt glare from Katara caused him to swiftly shut his mouth. That. Suki, don't worry, he tried to brush off her concern gingerly as he could. I'll be careful. Like you were careful against Azula? Came the retort. Naruto, she burned you. Her words caused him to cringe. He was well aware of the still healing scar lining his neck. He'd gained it when deflecting Azula's bolt of lightning. It had actually managed to char him a little before he grabbed and redirected it. The injury didn't impede him, but it still served as a brutal reminder of what might happen should he ever hold himself back in the heat of battle like that again. That was the first and last time he'd underestimated a firebender, or anyone, for that matter. That won't happen again. Agitated though he might be, Naruto refused to let it show. If you just hear me out. I'm sorry, I can't agree with this plan. It puts you in too much danger. Let me know when you've thought of something less dangerous. She walked away and out of the barn before anyone could think to stop her. The ensuing silence tasted like ash in Naruto's throat. Why was she so worried about him? Suki, she'll be back, Sokka yawned. What matters now is that we get some shut-eye, obviously. We've got a big day ahead of us tomorrow. I'm going to bed. Naruto groaned as the others grabbed their bag and prepared to turn in. Wisely refraining from saying anything, everyone, save Katara, she alone approached him, realizing his distress whereas the others did their best to avoid it, not for lack of caring, but out of fear for angering the powerful shinobi. Are you alright? She asked, touching a hand to his shoulder. Naruto feigned a shrug. Was it something I said? She just worries about you. Yeah, I gathered that much, honestly, He would have said more, had not his injury flared up. Tongues of invisible fire shot up and down his neck. A silent reminder of the near-miss he'd suffered back on Kyoshi Island. Katara saw him cringe, and dipped a hand into the pouch she wore around her arm. Almost before he knew it he felt the cool touch of water upon his neck. Stinging, yes, but soothing the worst of the pain. It had not the healing properties of proper medicine, not yet, but he sensed she'd soon lean about her powerful talents. Till then, he'd just bear with the wound and let it heal. She really hurt you, didn't she? Katara soothed, running her still wet hand across the fresh scar, numbing it even further. Naruto bit back another sigh. Nothing I haven't endured before. Naruto, I think Suki might be right. She indicated a bale of hay and forced him to sit so she could tend the wound further. Your plan's rather reckless. Not you too. Naruto groaned childishly as she complied with her demand. Why is everyone so concerned about me? Have you all forgotten just how strong I am? It's not just me, Katara replied, running her hands over his neck. Everyone worries about you. The way you throw yourself into battle, it's almost like you're suicidal. The former shinobi ruthlessly bit back the urge to snap at her for the unperceived slight. Death was the last thing he wanted. But he daren't tell her that. There you go, all done. Sking softly to himself, the last shinobi sat up, his treatment finished. Fine, he relented, because you asked so nicely. I'll try to be more careful. Her smile was nothing short of dazzling. Oh, and by the way, she leaned closer, if you ever mention that bit about me wanting to marry you when I was little. Yes? This time, the smile was so cold it actually made him shiver. I'll bury you in a glacier. With that, she strode away. Naruto watched her go, shaking his head. Why did he always attract deadly women? Why? Why couldn't his life just be simple? Later that night, his life became even more complicated. Naruto had chosen to take the first watch, on the off chance that the guard from before wanted to exact his vengeance on Haru's shop. They'd be in for a nasty surprise, that they would. Still, it was a lonely duty, trying to stay awake, out here in the cold, all by himself. For a brief moment he imagined he was on his own again, with no friends or family to call his own. It made him shudder. Those thought of belling alone were no longer a passing fear. Now it was a nightmare of sorts. He'd spent so much time in a group that the thought of leaving them behind actually hurt. That'll happen someday, he reminded himself. Make no mistake, if this war didn't kill Katara and his newfound friends, then old age certainly would. The vile old one enemy even he couldn't defeat, time. Everything had been so much easier when he'd only need worry about himself. Now it seemed everywhere they went, their little group grew a little larger. First was Suki on Kyoshi. Now in this desolate little village, Haru. Aang just might have found a way to start learning earthbending in him, even if the young bender decided to remain behind once they went on their way, which remained quite likely. Who knew what would come to pass next? Once, that would have sorrowed him. Now he refused to look to the future. He'd long since resolved to live in the moment, since joining the Southern Water Tribe. Trying to gaze ahead into his future would only bring upon him untold sorrow. His strange little family was only growing. That should make him happy, right? He pinched his whiskered cheeks. Happy! His thoughts were broken by the crack of a broken branch somewhere behind him. Alert, he rounded with a hiss and stepped toward the darkness, Rinnegan flaring. Who goes there? Relax? A familiar voice soothed. It's me. Suki? Naruto relaxed a touch, baffled to find none other than Suki emerging from the black at his flank. Don't do that. I could have killed you. She looked fearsome in her armor, but somehow the lack of makeup made her appear almost fragile, he thought. Sorry, the Kyoshi warrior smiled softly. At least she had the good grace to look sheepish. I couldn't sleep. You too, huh? The brunette nodded in affirmation, coming to stand beside him. I thought I'd come to relieve you. Naruto shook his head. Not tired. The words lapsed into awkward silence. Neither dared glance at one another, painfully aware of the argument they'd had mere hours before. At last, Naruto couldn't take it anymore. He'd been so caught up in his plan for prankdom that he'd failed to notice the lone voice of dissent in the group. Was it right for him to just dismiss her out of turn like that? Of course not. He needed to pause and consider the other's thoughts, not throw himself headlong into battle and cause chaos without a care. He opened his mouth to speak, and so too did she. I'm sorry. They apologized in the same instant. There was a brief moment of hesitation. Then the two teens laughed, the tension bursting forth from them in a single guffaw. Just like that, it was over. The rift between them was closed. It was wrong of me to call you foolish, Suki admitted. And it was wrong of me to be so reckless, Naruto replied. So I guess we're good then? Guess so. Darn, she swore, her pale face flushing beneath the moonlight. I feel like a complete idiot. At his questing look, she continued. Here I had this grand speech prepared, and then you forgive me. Just like that. What am I supposed to do now? You could always stay and watch the stars with me, Naruto drawled, gazing upward at the thousands of tiny pinpricks above, the raiment of heaven hanging over their heads. I was keeping watch for that firebender from before, but I think he's given up for the day. He sat and patted the spot beside him, quietly wondering whether or not she would accept the unspoken invitation. I'd like that. Naruto felt his heart skip a beat as the young warrior accepted his offer, sitting down and scooting dangerously close to him. When her hand came to rest atop his, he nearly jumped out of his skin, but Suki was flushing just as much as he, so he bore with it. That's the star of Kyoshi. She indicated a particularly bright pinprick of light with her finger. You can see it from almost anywhere in the world. Naruto whistled. I had no idea you were well versed in astrology. It's nice, isn't it? She murmured, laying her head on his shoulder, still peering up at the stars. I could just stare at them all night. Naruto made no move to pull away. If Suki was interested in him, then so be it. He was beginning to understand now, see the futility of it all. Nothing he said to her would change her mind short of outright violence, and right now he just didn't have the heart to push her away. A sudden pang of guilt stabbed at his heart as they stood there beneath the stars. This girl trusted him, looked out for him, wanted the best for his sake. And here he was all but lying to a fellow member of Team Avatar, someone whom he just might be developing feelings for. Suki, there's something I need to tell you. Yes? I'm not the Avatar, he blurted out. There was another silence, this one charged with awkward tension. Suki pulled away from Naruto, her auburn eyes boring deep into his own. When she finally spoke, her voice was the barest of whispers. I know. You knew? Naruto's jaw nearly hit the ground. What? When? For a few weeks now, she admitted, suddenly sheepish. I realized around the time when we left Kyoshi. It was always Aang who kept focusing on saving the world, not you. When I saw the marking and his bending, it kinda became obvious. When I asked Sokka and Katara, they fessed up that it was their idea. At the blonde's pensive expression, she offered up a slight smile. I'm not angry, you know. I understand why you lied to me back then. You might not be the Avatar everyone was looking for, but you were just doing what you felt right, I suppose. Well, that's just it. A wry smile pulled at his lips. It felt good to open up, especially to her. I suppose you could say I am an Avatar, but not like Aang. My abilities don't focus primarily on the elements, but other areas of that aspect. They make me almost invincible, but I can still be injured. Here he touched hand to his scar, still be killed. That was why I spoke out earlier. When those words came, they nearly floored him, But it was nothing compared to what came next. We still need you. I need you, she said the last part in a very tiny voice. Were an ordinary man present, he wouldn't have heard it. But Naruto was no ordinary man. He heard every word. Why? The warrior blinked slowly. Why what? Why would you need someone like me? Because you're you, Suki replied. Even with all your imperfection, you might be stubborn, headstrong, reckless. Naruto coughed. Ahem, sitting right here. Oh, sorry, Suki flushed. Anyway, you inspired me, she continued, her voice gaining force with each word. Until the day we met, I thought Kyoshi was all that mattered. There was nothing else, no one else. I didn't care about the Fire Nation, or about the war. Heck, I'd been convinced the Avatar didn't exist until you and Aang showed up. But you proved me wrong. I decided to leave Kyoshi because of you. It doesn't matter whether you're the Avatar or not, you still showed me I have much to learn. Reminded me that there's an entire world out there for me to see. A world that will be destroyed by the Fire Nation if something isn't done. Her words were so impassioned by the time she finished. Naruto was literally left in awe. I'm glad I could inspire you. So, back on Kyoshi. What you saw were shinobi skills, Suki. I gained them a lifetime ago. Darn, she pouted. And here I was hoping you could teach me. A slight smile played on her pale features. It might not be real bending, but I'd love to learn. Naruto actually blinked at that. He never once considered taking on a student in this land. He was the last of a great people, and would likely still reincarnate time and time again. But to restart the shinobi people as a whole, why hadn't he thought of this sooner? Was this what he was meant to do? Recreate his people? He wasn't sure. I suppose I could try. Really? I don't see why not, Naruto shrugged. But I should warn you. I'm a strict teacher, His words died away as her lips touched his cheek for the second time since they'd met. Why? I look forward to learning from you then, Sifu Naruto. She rose and performed a deep bow. And I'll see you later, good night. What was it that drew strong, deadly girls to him? Katara hadn't struck him as dangerous until this evening. Her threat about burying him had been quite real. Suki was a warrior herself, now aspiring to be a shinobi in a world of benders and non-benders. Then there had been that hellcat from the Fire Nation, Azula. That was one hell of a fighter. There, idly, he wondered, what was Princess Hothead up to now? Meanwhile, you should be afraid of me. Azula jumped to a sighting position in her cot on the ship with a small scream, her eyes popping open wide, sweat on her forehead and her breath coming in small shallow gasps. A dream, she realized, willing her frantic heart to stop beating its way out of her chest. It had been just a dream, nothing more and nothing less. The princess tried to tell to the adrenaline coursing through her veins, quietly willing her body to accept what her mind already knew to be true. It was all a dream. She told herself that repeatedly as she tried to settle back down on the cot. It was all a dream. She tried to stare at the still-lit candles of her cabin until she fell asleep. But they cast shadows and played havoc with her mind. She was literally jumping at the sight of them. Closing her eyes didn't help either. She was terrified he would come for her in the dark, terrified, and yet strangely excited. The longer she lay there, the more that excitement began to exert itself. The thrill of facing a strong opponent warring with the terror of being made a helpless little girl before him. Just a dream, she reminded herself. Just a dream, just a dream, just a dream. But if it was a dream, why did it hurt? Sleep-gummed eyes creaked open once more and surveyed her cabin, barely able to comprehend her dimming surroundings. Wait a minute, she bolted upright again. Memories blazing through her mind like an inferno of otherworldly fire. The Avatar. He'd killed her. Hadn't he? She clearly recalled tasting blood in her mouth, feeling her spirit depart her body. And yet here she was, as though she'd woken up from a horrible dream. But it was no dream, it had been real, all too real. Why am I not dead? She thought, checking herself for injuries. Thankfully, she found some. Thankfully, because it meant she wasn't losing her mind. That twinge in her right side bespoke of a recently healed broken rib, and the dull pulse of her ankle warned that her left ankle was still very much sprained. Her cheek was horribly sore. There would be a bruise tomorrow morning if she was lucky, swelling if she wasn't. Apparently only the most life-threatening injuries had been tended to. Her wounds were still healing, but they looked as though they'd been tended to recently. Perhaps only a few days ago. She knew none of her men were capable in the healing arts. Most of them barely knew how to try and bandage their own. That left the Avatar, Naruto. He must have done this. But why? Why kill her and bring her back? It was well known that the Avatar had power over the spirit world, but she hadn't thought that a being like that could bring the dead back, bring her back. Try as she might, she just couldn't muster up the rage she needed to hate him. Terror at what he'd done to her, yes, and excitement at the prospect of fighting him again. But anger? No, it simply wouldn't come. What has he done to me? She touched a hand to her head, the room still swimming in the candlelight. Why, she whispered to herself, tucking her knees into her chest, why did you do that, you fool? Her last words were little more than a soft, lonely whisper. Why did you heal me? The next morning, they took Haru's mother. Naruto bolted upright, lurching out of his sleeping bag as Sokka's cry filled the barn. Rather, he tried, something warm and soft, though no necessarily heavy, pushed him back down. It took him less than an instant to recognize that familiar bob of brown hair in his peripherals, Suki. Somehow, she'd crawled into his sleeping bag overnight. How on earth? Never mind, he was a shinobi. For the love of those gods, honestly, after that kiss last night, he should have expected something like this. Kakashi-sensei's words rang in his mind from ages past. Look underneath the underneath. Thankfully no one noticed in the chaos. Everyone was too busy darting outside to investigate the burns outside, Haru in particular. Naruto was suddenly and intensely grateful that he'd hidden the boy further back in the barn, rather than risk him being discovered, but now was not the time for such things. In that time it took for everyone to scramble out, Naruto managed to jostle Suki awake, and after a bit of flushing on both of their parts, they were able to squirm free without anyone being the wiser. We speak of this to no one. Suki nodded fervently. Agreed. They emerged to find the shop scorched beyond all recognition, the ground blackened and twisted, for at least a mile around. Talk about your scorched earth responses. Evidently, the firebenders hadn't taken too kindly to Naruto's little prank. Haru was visibly trembling with anger, tiny pebbles stirring at his feet, whilst he struggled to control his anger, prevent himself from erupting into a terrifying display of earth-bending prowess. But the leash on his bending was thin, and the poor boy looked as though he might snap at any instant, if someone didn't say something. Haru! Naruto barked, front and center. The boy went stiff as a rod. Why yes, Avatar Naruto? Naruto silently resolved to tell the boy the truth later. But for now, he needed to take command, or the poor kid was going to kill someone. We're getting your mother back. In fact, we'll be bringing all the earthbenders back, he declared, right here, right now. But the plan is about to be improvised, Naruto replied sternly, beckoning them closer. Come here, all of ya. I'll have to henge the lot of you for this to work. Wow! Aang glanced down at his illusory body in utter awe, barely able to believe what his fellow avatar had done to the six of them. They all looked like firebenders. Right down to the armor. Haru and Suki remained stoically silent, the latter deciding not to wonder just how Naruto had. Sokka and Katara appeared to be visibly chafing at their new albeit temporary appearance. Appa and Momo had been left behind in the barn. Changing their appearance wouldn't do anything but hinder the group, and no one would believe a firebender with a sky bison. It won't last, a slightly winded Naruto explained. I can only maintain those forms for an hour or so. Guess we'll have to make this quick. And to think, I was so looking forward to using the rotten eggs and glue I'd sealed away. Ah well, I can always make it better. Drawing himself up, he transformed into Azula, assuming the role with an eerie level of grace. Now remember, he began, you'll need follow my lead. No talking, no showboating. You're supposed to be my elite guard for this little venture, nothing more. Do not speak unless spoken to. Once we get aboard, get out of sight and drop the transformations. The rest is up to you. With the plan in place, he led them to the nearest garrison, kicked down the door, and barged in. You there, soldier? The Fire Nation lieutenant had just opened his mouth to reply, only for his jaw to slam into the ground once he laid eyes upon Azula striding toward him. Princess Azula? I take it you know who I am? Why yes, my lady. He swiftly fell to a knee in genuflection. Your father did not inform us of your arrival. We weren't expecting you. Had you sent word, I would have prepared a proper welcome. No need, Naruto silenced him with a wave. I am here of my own accord. Now, what is your name? Lieutenant Shu, my lady, the man barely stammered out. If I may ask, to what do we owe the honor? Consider this a surprise inspection, Lieutenant Shu. The smile Naruto generated was entirely genuine. Henge or not, I'm touring the colonies, making certain everything is up to par as per my father's standards. I understand you have an offshore prism responsible for manufacturing coal, Do you not? At the man's nod, the pseudo-princess continued, As I thought, take me to this so-called prison of yours, soldier. I wish to see it for myself, personally. Will your guards be accompanying us as well, my lady? Yes, of course we will. Naruto waved off the man's concern with the royal we he'd heard by so many arrogant nobles in his land. Another touch of genjutsu was all it took to bend the man's mind to his will, to prevent him from questioning the strange behavior of these so-called guards. Of course, princess, I now know why I enjoy breaking in and out of prisons. It isn't the food, nor the guards, and it certainly isn't the people, not the slate-gray walls or the lumpy beds either. It is something far more base than that, a vile little word that I have come to love, pranking. Barring that, there is one other word. That word would best be described as riot. Naruto as Azula was laughing his head off as he flung fireballs at the hapless Fire Nation guards. Aang's trick had worked flawlessly, summoning up coal from the vents. A few impassioned words from Katara toward the Earthbenders, and that was their cue for Azula to lose her pretty little head and join the resistance. Their transformations dropped away in hiding. Katara and the others were thus free to leap into action and wreak all manner of havoc upon the warden and his men in spectacular fashion. In short, all bloody hell broke loose. I do so love it when a plan comes together. For the next hour, the entire Fire Nation prison experienced pure hell. But that was not Naruto's intention. No, this had been done for one reason and one reason only. Impersonating a Fire Nation princess was certainly a pricey little move, but making everyone think said princess was on the side of the enemy was utterly priceless. In short, Azula's feared reputation of being the Fire Nation's best was brought crumbling down around her unknowing ears in a matter of minutes. Now, when the Fire Nation spoke of their beloved princess, they would speak of only one thing. Azula had gone mad. Banished? Azula could barely believe her ears when she received word by messenger hawk 2 days later. Me? By father? What do you mean? What did I do? When the bird simply sat there, she turned it into all but a roast chicken and demanded her cooks serve it up for dinner. No, she whispered fervently, suffering a mental and comical breakdown. I can't be banished. Not me. I'm not like Zuzu. I'm father's favorite. There's no way I could be banished. There's just no way. Somewhere miles away, Uzumaki Naruto was laughing his ass off. Naruto took one look at Sokka, saw his expression, and swerved his head to look back at the clouds. Why was it that everyone saw fit to interrupt his meditations? Realizing he wouldn't have any peace until Sokka had his say, the last shinobi reluctantly rounded on the young water tribe warrior to see what he had to say. Sokka was looking at him most strangely, his body tense, expression pensive. Naruto adopted a curious facade of his own, wondering what might have perturbed his friend so. Now we've got an earthbender, the boy ventured hesitantly. Naruto's gaze slipped to Haru, Peace-Sply levitating a few pebbles in his right hand, turning them end over end, relentlessly. Rescuing his mother and father had worked wonders for the boy's self-confidence, but even here in the clouds, he preferred to keep to himself, speaking only when spoken to. Yes, it would seem so. Just wondering. But are we going to pick up a firebender too? Aang promptly spat out his tea, creating a small geyser of warm liquid. It would have sailed over the edge, but Katara simply waterbended it back into his cup. The young avatar shot his friend a quick and grateful glance, followed by a series of sheepish chuckles from the others at his predicament. Suki herself managed to keep a grip on her teacup. Naruto refused to say where he'd procured all this gear from, but at the mention of firebending, even her normally sunny disposition darkened. Yeah, what are we going to do about that? As much as I hate to admit it, Sokka has a point. Hey, Suki's right, Katara agreed. We might be able to find Aang a teacher for water and earth. But her still has to learn Master Fire, doesn't he? There was a silence as Team Avatar mulled it over. I think Azula or Zuko would make a fine teacher, Naruto suggested. Or maybe Iroh? Aang nearly spat out his tea again. The blonde didn't take too kindly to that. Oi, he sighed as Katara once more waterbent the liquid back into the cup. I went to all the trouble of making that way up here, you know. And it ain't easy. Show some appreciation, Aang. Sorry. After being pursued by a small army of firebenders after their wildly successful jailbreak, Team Avatar was currently traveling over water once more, taking a much-needed opportunity to recuperate from their successful attack and subsequent escape until they reached land once more. Even now they could see a patch of earthy green and brown growing steadily larger in the distance. But for now there was only the open ocean under their feet. the salty smell of the sea and cries of seagulls flitting past. Now, even those birds seemed to fall silent as Naruto's words truly sank in. You can't be serious. Finally, Haru found his voice. Putting your friendship with the Dragon of the West aside, there are enemies. Why would they want to help us? At Naruto's glower, the poor bender nearly fell to pieces right then and there. Faltering beneath his teacher's scrutiny, Prince Zuko, he began. Currently exiled prince. I know, he had the good grace to at least appear chastised at Naruto's caustic remark. But that's just it, he's a prince, former or not, and I doubt Azula would be willing to teach Aang anything after the stunt we just pulled back in my hometown. If anything, she probably wants to kill you even more if she still thinks you're the Avatar. In fact, I wouldn't put it past her to get at you through us. No offense, Sifu Naruto. But I think she just enjoys hurting people. There was a moment of quiet killer intent in which everyone could feel all of their inner fears coming true. Despite having only met the mad girl once, Naruto had made them well aware of her methods. If she could hurt him through them, if she could get to him by causing one of them pain, he'd do more than just defeat the princess. He'd obliterate the entire Fire Nation itself. Finally, when it seemed that they would be suffocated by his anger at any moment, the blonde spoke up to quell those fears. Haru, Suki, Aang, he drawled, his visage turning stern. Come here, all three of ya. As they looked on, he placed a thumb in his mouth and bit down. Hard blood gushed forth from the wound, dribbling down his arms to form a small scrawl of kanji upon his left bicep. Your hand. Leave it, came the reply. I need it to mark you guys. Momo squeaked as Naruto pressed his still bleeding thumb to the lemur's forehead. When it came away, there was a small, but unreadable kanji imprinted there. What is that? Suki wondered aloud. It's called the Hiraishin, Naruto answered, tracing the kanji into Haru's shoulder. It allows me to teleport to a place or person I've marked in the past. Sokka and Katara already have it. He did not wilt in the slightest at their admonishing glances. It was necessary. Before he left, your father asked a favor of me. He told me to protect you, the both of you. Placing the Hiraishin on you just seemed natural at the time. How else was I to keep you safe? Besides, Sokka's mark is just between his shoulder blades. He'd never have known about it otherwise. Katara opened her mouth to protest, only to snap it shut as something occurred to her. Naruto noticed. Something wrong, Katara? Where? Her voice was little more than a tiny squeak. Did you mark me? Where? I said, where did you mark me? Naruto just stared at her and began laughing. It's not funny, she told him. Yes, it is, he howled. Only you would think I'd do something like that. After finally managing to calm down, he looked back at Katara, suddenly aware of the deft motions of her hands. Wait a second, what are you doing with that water argh? He barely had time to finish with that sentence before water spewed up and out of her pouch, sending him flying off Appa into his death miles below, or, so everyone thought. 7 seconds passed after he toppled over the edge, 7 seconds of agonizing silence. Still, no one made any effort to retrieve the fallen blonde. Suki began to fret. She knew Naruto's body was near immortal. But even so, a fall into the ocean from this height might well spell his doom. The last thing she wanted was for her precious teacher, the boy whom she'd begun to feel for, fall to his doom so early in their journey. Fearing what she would find, the Kyoshi warrior peered over the edge. All she saw was a few Naruto-sized impressions in the clouds below, a sure sign that it had been a fast and furious fall to the water below. What if he was hurt? What if Aang was only a split second faster than her, springing to his feet, light as a breeze, ready to hurl himself out into oblivion after his friend? We have to go get him. Relax, Arrowhead, Sokka soothed. Sifu's fine. Suki was inclined to agree. But shouldn't we do something? Nah, the warrior went back to sharpening his boomerang. Give him a few seconds. Are you sure? He's right, Katara seconded, leaning back in the saddle, her brief burst of anger gone, little more than a memory. If something like that could have killed Sifu, he wouldn't be here now. Why does everyone call him that? The young Avatar asked. He's not your teacher, is he? Not anymore, no, but he did teach me a few things about bending when I was little, Katara replied. You'd be amazed what he could do with water. I learned a few moves from him back then, too. Sokka performed a perfunctory swing with his club for added emphasis. Naruto's a decent guy outside of battle, but when it comes to anything involving actual combat, or worse, training, he's a slave driver, right, Katara? Both brother and sister shuddered at some unspeakable memory. I'm so glad he doesn't make me run laps around the South Pole anymore. Or make me waterbend for 2 days straight, Katara added with a small shiver of her own. Haru and Suki exchanged nervous glances. And then there was the one time. Sokka! Stop! Katara cried. We are not, under any circumstance, mentioning that to anyone, ever again. The rest of Team Avatar silently sweat dropped. Well, promise to teach me the shinobi arts. Suki smiled nervously. I don't think he's that excessive. Nai Setri but flattery one twerk and may. Scarce had she spoken than Naruto reappeared, his words and body roaring past them and into the sky, his abrupt ascent showering everyone with droplets at his passing. He did not look nor sound pleased at all. Suki couldn't tell whether he was wet from Katara's water, or if it had anything to do with short dip in the ocean just now. Regardless, he was quite the sight, soaring through the clouds like some wayward angel, streaked in otherworldly luminance. Wait a minute, was Naruto actually glowing? He was. Bathed in saffron light from head to toe, he was the picture of godhood. Those eerie red orbs held her, captivated her, drew her in. I want. Her cheeks burst into furious flames seconds later, as she realized what she just thought. Ah! Down, girl! Down! The Kyoshi warrior ruthlessly shook her head, desperately seeking inner peace and clarity as her teacher alighted beside her, effortlessly gliding down from the heavens to steal a place at her side. That golden glow and those eerie markings still shone from his body. Up close he looked downright intimidating within the cloak. She could see she wasn't the only one thunderstruck by the blonde's newfound appearance. Katara mouth hung agape as well. Clearly the waterbender was just as baffled by this transformation. Honestly, he never ceased to amaze her. Watch those wandering eyes, girls, Naruto admonished, grinning. Wouldn't want to get the wrong idea. Suki was fairly certain her face was flaming, even behind. Well, Katara stuttered, recovering herself. I'm glad you're all right. Naruto's language could have melted the iron hull off a Fire Nation vessel. Thankfully, his cursing was spoken in his native tongue. Crazy girl. He finished with a hiss. I know I taught you to be ready at a moment's notice, but that was ridiculous. It's your own fault for teasing me, the brunette chided lightly. If you just told me where you'd put the seal instead of laughing, I wouldn't have overreacted. Naruto opened his mouth to reply, and promptly snapped it shut. True, she did have a point, but hey, it had been so long since he'd laughed like that. Katara didn't exactly need to know about it, did she? Yet, so instead of arguing, he forced himself to relent and grin beneath her glare. Won't happen again. Looks aside, there was just something about righteous female fury that made even him wary of her when she was like this. Apparently, Sokka did not fear the female fury. He merely fell off the saddle himself in laughter. Never would have thought he'd be afraid of Katara. What was that, Sokka? And nothing. Aang, get back over here, Naruto said, ignoring the bickering siblings and biting his thumb for a second time. I still need to mark ya. Reluctantly the young bender did as he was told, trying his utmost not to flinch in dismay when he saw that bloody digit. But why your blood? The boy asked squeamishly as the shinobi traced the symbol onto his left bicep. Is that really necessary? Naruto sighed, air-drying himself with a jutsu before falling back to Appa's back. It seems clouds are made out of water after all. But first, let's answer your question. Yes, saying, it is necessary. Ink might wash off, my blood won't. Not if I don't want it to, it'll never wash off. By using my own blood as a catalyst, the seal itself is strengthened, allowing me be able to travel farther. For example, Katara could be in the Fire Nation, and I'd still be able to reach her where I say, back home in the South Pole, for example, although it might take me a few minutes to travel that far. Sokka thumbed at his chin. That's pretty powerful stuff. Naruto noticed Suki looking at him hopefully. Sorry, he mollified her. I'm afraid I'm the only one who can use it. In any case, it's your turn. Pick a spot. Alright, she nervously pulled back the collar of her dress, allowing him to brand her just below her neck, alt not without a small flush. One could easily see it, even within her makeup. Naruto wisely chose not to tease the poor girl any further than he already had, and certainly not in the presence of Katara. He still wasn't entirely sure what his former student felt for him, or what the addition of Suki had done to impact what had been a stable friendship from years past. One would have thought she'd outgrown her childhood crush on him long ago, but the events of the last few weeks had recently done much to shake that rock-solid opinion. To antagonize her just wouldn't be fair. For now, having finished the brand, the blonde clambered off the saddle and pressed his hand to Appa's furry head. The sky bison rumbled questioningly, but not before trying to reach its head around and lick him. Here you go, buddy, he soothed, just to be safe. Wait, Aang frowned. Why Appa? We rely on him to fly us everywhere, Naruto pointed out, his glare scathing. You and I might be able to fly on our own power, but if something were to happen to the old boy, the rest of us would be up a creek without a paddle. Now, if someone ever tries to target him, I'll know of it, and if he were to be, gods forbid, captured, I'd be there to prevent it. Sound good? You've really thought of everything, haven't you? I try, Naruto yawned. Right then, I'm going to take a nap. Suki, I want you to practice the meditation I showed you the other day, okay? Do that a couple of times and I might be able to do something about your chakra problem. Yes, Sifu. Despite himself, the one time Jinchuriki actually felt his ears burn a bit. Perhaps it was being called a teacher. Perhaps it had something to do with the fact that he'd never really taken on a student of his own before. In any case, he felt his cheeks warm with pride at being addressed as Sifu. For the first time since coming to this land, it was nice, but it was also tiring, to keep track of so many, to ensure that no harm came to his little. His task completed for the time being, Naruto leaned back in the saddle, consigning himself to a nap. It was peaceful up here amongst the clouds, one might think. You could simply drift off without so much as a care in the world. Content to do just that, he drifted off almost immediately, lulled into peaceful slumber by the gentle breeze and the promise of doing good. That was when the nightmares came. They always seized upon him when he least expected it, preying on these moments of weakness. He saw the world as a firebender would, bathed in beautiful flames, reduced to ash by his hand. As always, a girl stood at his right, and until this very moment, he hadn't been able to recognize her. Now he saw, and now he knew, just as he knew her laughter, recognized those amber eyes and ebony hair. Azula. The scene blurred, leaving him dwelling in darkness. Murderer, a voice whispered out from the ether. Show yourself, he demanded, squaring his jaw and facing the dark. His mind knew what he would face, but his body was another story. His legs were powerless, helpless to move, as more than 1,000 hands sprouted from the earth, latching onto his ankles and dragging him down. Blue eyes scrunched shut, refusing to look into the faces of his captors, knowing full well what he would find there, the face of Hinata, of all those he had ever loved, all his friends, family, everyone he'd ever known, all those he'd left behind in the passage of time. Traitor, another voice hissed in his ear. He massacred many, he betrayed his own friends, he killed his own family. One such as him should not exist. He should be put to death. He should be killed by the ones he's slain. So ensorcelled was in his nightmare that he nearly didn't notice when Aang started jostling him awake hours later. He jerked upright with a small hiss, barely strangling the scream that threatened to come tearing out of his throat and into the open air. Cold sweat slicked his skin, his heart hammering out of his chest. Just a dream, he told himself. Just a dream, just a dream, just a dream. Are you all right? Suki was suddenly there, laying a hand across his shoulder. Naruto bit back a hiss as he remembered all those palms, clawing at him, tearing at his throat. I'm fine, really, because you looked like you were having a nightmare. I am fine. At her hurt expression, his own softened. Really, I am. It was just an old nightmare. A muscle jumped in Naruto's jaw, his temper threatening to overtake him in that instant. He bit back a growl, his blue eyes flicking towards the young avatar. Drop it, Aang, he sighed. I'll tell you later. Sorry, it's just I've been thinking. Taking those words in stride, the former Jinchuriki reluctantly rose, shaking off the last vestiges of sleep. And what, pray tell, were you thinking about? The young avatar seemed to squirm beneath his gaze for what felt like an eternity before speaking. When he finally did, his words caused a pall to fall over the group. I think someone's trailing us. Sure enough, one could see smoke behind them on the horizon, a plume of black smoke rising in the distance. Katara let out a sigh as she sat up, stating, Let's just hope that it's not the Fire Nation. That's the last thing we need. Indeed. A silence poured into the saddle, and Naruto leaned back into the seat as he processed what he could recall from his dream. He was growing used to these visions of his, but what he'd seen had disconcerted him. Were these kids going to lose the war without his intervention? Of course not, he had every faith in them, but those images still chilled his soul. What if his interference upset the delicate balance of this land? Already he was considered the Avatar by many, and doubtless his presence here would prevent many deaths. But still, what was this sense of unease he felt? And what did Azula have to do with it? Was that the fate of the world if he didn't redeem her? He pondered that matter for quite some time, the land growing steadily closer with each passing minute. Within a few minutes, they wouldn't have to worry about any attacks from sea, which meant their position would be that much more fortified against any enemy attack. Haru frowned just then, peering over the saddle. Hey, don't look now, but I think that might be. Even as the words were being transmitted to his ears, Naruto was pressed back into the saddle by a sharp turn of Appa. Suddenly a good few of those aches and pains decided to protest their very existence from the pressure being exerted on him even through his own mental blockage. As soon as the pressure let up, he exhaled in relief before he quickly released his chakra hold on the saddle and stood, earning a few anxious looks from his friends as he did so. The hell was that? He fumbled with the balance for a split second before sticking his feet to the saddle with chakra again, and he glanced over the edge just in time to see a massive bale of fire flash in their direction. Pressure pushed him back on his heels. Appa ascended, avoiding a direct hit, but shuddering from the glancing blow of the heat nonetheless. He was jerked around on his feet a moment from a couple of turns before the smoke of an extremely large blast of flame filled his vision in close proximity. Blue flame. It was there for only a moment before they flew past it, revealing the distinctive wedge shape of a Fire Nation vessel, its black trim cutting in an angry swathe through the ocean below just in time for another shot to whistle perilously close. Azula, Aang finished with a gulp. Naruto groaned. Troublesome woman. Suki managed a nervous smile. Anyone want to bet she still steamed about that stunt we pulled? Sokka snorted. Oh please, she probably doesn't even. Oh my god. If it wasn't for Naruto's hold on his shirt, he was pretty sure he would be laying on the floor. But he was also pretty sure that he would be in equal amounts of pain if compared to his current situation. The furious heat raging below their position suddenly intensified, that mere candle becoming a raging flame as another blue-white fireball sizzled past. Grey-ara! Appa bellowed in pain as a small comet seared just beneath his stomach, drawing an angry line across his hide. Naruto and Aang were up in the same instant, already moving amidst the bison's bellow. No glances were exchanged, nor were any words spoken. They already knew that their furry friend would do his best to ferry the rest of the gang to safety. It could not be said who leaped first, only that each avatar flung himself over the edge, that both hurtled towards the ship, one borne by his glider, the other by his chakra alone. You don't have to help me, you know, Naruto shouted over the wind as they hurtled toward the flagship. I can handle this myself. You're just one person, Aang replied, struggling to make himself heard over the rising gale. It'd be wrong of me to let you do all the work. Suit yourself, Naruto cracked a crazed grin. But if you're suggesting we make a game of this. What? No, I wasn't. Too late. Race ya! With a massive exertion of his chakra, the blonde rocketed forward, reaching the lone ship mere moments before Aang had the chance to follow from his glider. In that moment, that brief instant of hesitation, he alighted loudly upon the prow of the ship, the sudden deacceleration creating an equally massive dent in the metal hull of the ship. He was left to take in everything in at a glance. The trebuchets, the soldiers, the firebenders, and there, standing at the head of them all, her eyes wide, her mouth open in a small, round O of disbelief. Azula, you! Every single soldier, bender or otherwise, scurried away at the sound of her voice. Azula might look composed, with not so much as a single hair out of place, but were one to look deeper, they could easily see what had long since lurked beneath. The beginnings of madness, unearthed by this sudden shift in power, and in his experience, madmen, or madwomen in this case, were the most dangerous of all. They did not conform to any one strategy or doctrine. Naruto grinned, snuffing her flung fireball out between his fists. So what brings you to these waters, princess? I hear the cod are quite nice this time of year. You know damn well why I'm here, fool. Her words rose with each syllable, pitching ever higher. I've been banished. And it's all your fault. Because you showed me mercy that day. It wasn't long until she was all but shrieking at him, cursing his very existence from the darkest depths of her soul. Father banished me, but not because of that. Because of you he called me a traitor, accused me of liberating Earth Kingdom peasants to spite him. I'm no better than Zuzu now. No. I'm worse. Even if I were to capture you, even were I to kill you, he'd never allow me to come home. Never. Oh right, Naruto mused, she probably doesn't understand that I impersonated her that day. Well, that's rough, he shrugged, settling for a half-truth. I wasn't aiming to get you banished when I revived you. Why did you do that? The sheer force of her exclamation rocked him back on his heels. "Ah, I thought you'd be a bit more grateful, considering." "Maybe I was, once," Azula hissed out, flinging a bolt of lightning, only to have it redirected in her face, nearly ending her for a second time, but not anymore. "No one believes me. They all think I'm crazy. They say I'm losing my mind. But they don't know what I know in my head, Avatar." "Yes, I know." She thrust a finely manicured finger at him. "You killed me. And then you brought me back. Do you have any idea of my shame? My humiliation? Bad enough to know that you'd ended my life once, but you had to bring me back for a second time? I don't understand. Was my death not good enough for you? Do you intend to make me suffer for challenging you? To humiliate me even further?" Those honey gold orbs held him. In that instant she was not a crazy fireball-slinging princess. She was simply a girl demanding answers, an explanation of why she had been wrong. Naruto exhaled a long-suffering sigh, pushing a hand through his matted locks. "Typical, my one act of kindness, and it backfires." "Pardon the cliché," he replied, "but I brought you back because I saw the good in you. Unlike most other firebenders, you can change, you can become something more than what you are. Your dim-witted brother has that potential too, but I doubt he'll realize it any time soon." Azula snarled, suddenly hesitant in the face of his empathy. "I am not good. You're just saying that so you can stab me in the back, like father and all the rest. Trust is overrated. Fear is the only way to ensure loyalty, and I know it." "I beg to differ," Naruto argued, readying himself for another fireball. "Trust is mutual. You have to give to receive, just as I chose to give you life again. I'd call that trust, wouldn't you?" He'd been right to ready his elf for another assault. This way the flame was nimbly avoided by jumping over the exile's head. "And what would you know of betrayal?" The former princess snarled and darted after him, trying and failing to close the gasp. "To be stabbed in the back by your own nation, having done all that they asked, day and night, without fail, only to be cast aside when you make one mistake? Do you?" Naruto broke away from her with a frown. "As a matter of fact, I know all too well the sting of betrayal," Indubitably he found himself replying, blue eyes narrowing to crimson slits. "I was betrayed by a man whom I'd thought to be my friend. He was a proud, foolish sod, who left our village in search of power. I tried to bring him back and failed. Instead I was forced to watch him change over the years, come to believe himself and his clan to be better than everyone and anyone else. I tried to make him see reason over the years, tried to remind him that he still had friends. But he wanted me gone, me, my family, and all that I stood for. In the end I had to kill him, but don't you see?" He spread his arms wide in invitation. "It's the reverse for you. Now that you've been banished you don't have to deal with the royal flaming asshole anymore." Whoosh! He nimbly dodged aside as another blue-black fireball whistled past his head. But he did not stop speaking. "Surely you must have friends outside the Fire Nation. You have the freedom to go see them now. In fact, I dare to say you have." "Why, you shut up!" Azula cried, covering her ears with both hands. "I don't want to hear this. Not from you. More freedom than anyone else in the world. Shut up." The burst of flame that followed her words was nothing short of spectacular. Her fireball spanned the entire width of the ship itself. There was no way he could dodge that without jumping overboard, and if he did that, he'd be exposed to the follow-up attack. There was really only one option. Naruto simply inhaled, and her flames withered and died, reduced to mere embers on the deck. Azula's voice was little more than a whisper. But that's not fair at all." "Ah, I see you've been practicing." He nudged the dark soot appraisingly with a foot. "Your flames are almost black now. They'll never be quite up to snuff with my Amaterasu. But still you continue to impress. Tell me, if I were to say that you can fight me any time, would you calm down?" Assuming what?" Azula regarded him warily, half expecting an attack, and by the gods themselves she got one. "Assuming you can swim." Naruto grinned and struck down upon the deck once, twice, thrice. Each strike split steel and twine before his knuckles, reverberating through the vessel's hull with such force that he actually flipped the ship into the air and broke it in half, sending the separate halves careening away from one another, end over end. Plunging the princess and her soldiers into the drink, the avatar of the gods snapped off a sarcastic salute, and launched himself backwards, ripping into the air, patted his hands, smiling smugly down at the ship. Well, guess I'd better check up on Katara and the others. Had he tarried a moment longer, he might have seen the smaller lifeboat jettisoned forth from its remains. Had he stayed, perhaps risked a glance backwards, he might have spared himself much pain and suffering. But the Avatar of the gods did not, and because he did not, things changed, and thus he left, Azula trailing in his wake. Now I'm sure you're wondering, why the pep talk? Why spare her life twice? At the time, I'd already wrested so much away from her. At the time, I simply couldn't bear the thought of taking her life again as well. I'll have to talk to Aang about that. Kid's far too soft-hearted for his own good. If he has any say in it, he probably won't even kill the Fire Lord. Somebody needs to toughen the boy up. Might as well be me. But I'm getting off track. Why spare Azula? Why let her live, and risk her causing chaos again and again, time after time? Looking back, the answer's pretty obvious to me. Guess I just have a thing for tragic souls. But when it happened, well, that changed a few things. Well, looks like I missed a few things. Naruto felt ash fill his throat as he descended to the ground as he beheld the destruction sprawled out before them. A bitter taste had swelled up upon his tongue, and not just because from the soot at their feet. It was the knowledge that the Fire Nation would commit such horrendous acts simply because they could. Some of them might be redeemable. Some, but not all. No mere forest fire could have done this. Fire Nation? He asked Sokka, expression grim. Fire Nation. What, no jokes? Naruto's deadpan was barely concealed. I'm counting on you for some comedy here. Sorry man, I got nothing after seeing this. You were burned again, Suki sighed, indicating the sorry state of his cloak. I'm more concerned about Appa. It's just a graze, Katara confirmed. He'll be fine in a day or two. Well, that's good too. He broke off as he saw Aang come towards him. Why did you do that? Do what, Arrowhead? He sighed as the Avatar stalked closer, his expression one of righteous anger. You killed all those people on the boat when you tore it in half. Aang, Katara began, but Naruto cut her off with a hand. My dear boy, I did not kill them, he chastised, tone colder than ice itself. The ocean did that. If they can swim, they'll be fine. If they can't, then it's their own fault for attacking us. Perhaps if you grew a pair you'd learn to accept death as a natural part of life. You wouldn't be so squeamish about these things. Before the young monk could hope to continue, the blonde turned his attention elsewhere. Now, Earth Boy. Come here, we have a lot of work to do if we want to restore this forest. Aye, yes sir. He bade Haru come close, and together, the two of them tilled the earth. Haru with his earthbending and Naruto with his own application of raw power and ninjutsu. Within a matter of mere moments, the ashen soil had been properly tilled, better than before. But he didn't stop there. When their work was done, he shooed the young bender away and set to work himself, as only a shinobi could. What are you going to do? Katara gulped, suddenly filled with trepidation. Naruto? This, grunting, the blonde performed a single set of seals and clenched his hands together. You'd be amazed by the bloodlines you gain after absorbing an all-powerful monster. Without another word he spread into a horse stance, clasped his palms, and uttered a single phrase. Mokuton, Jukai Koten, would style deep forest emergence. With those words he breathed life back into the forest. Literally. Roots arose from the sundered soil, spreading upward to form trunks, then branches, then entire trees themselves, their tendrils digging deep into the loamy soil. As the gang looked on, they watched the ruinated soil burning from black to a healthy shade of brown, then a deep, verdant green. Before long the towering oaks began to blot out the sun itself, and yet the light still shone. Within minutes the forest was whole, or, barring that, a great deal better off than it had once been. It was a pleasant feeling, restoring what had been destroyed. Golden daggers of sunlight crept in through the branches and slashed at their eyes, unpleasantly forcing them to squint as the forest rose around them in a susurrus of crackling branches and growing roots, their hands before their faces, as if they still had any reason to protect them from anything anymore. Team Avatar opened their eyes, to momentarily blind themselves before Naruto's radiance. He stood there in a cradle of light, grinning from ear to ear, and then, just as suddenly as his cloak had emerged, it vanished. The trees creaked to a half around him, their leafy limbs still stretching out towards the setting sun in unspoken prayer. Sokka took a look around and whistled. I can't believe you just did that. Yeah, it's a bit tiring, Naruto yawned, creating a forest out of a single acorn. I can't believe it either. Scarce curtain of flame descended the shadows to light the newly made forest aflame. Branches went up. The gang turned to face this intruder and found themselves face to face with none other than a sopping wet Azula, she'd since lose her braid in the crash, and was dripping from head to toe, and yet somehow, in spite of all this, she still managed to look absolutely terrifying, at least to the others. Oh, was that important? She grinned eerily. I think that was important. Aang Bison, Naruto ground out, eating forward, village, now, but, now. Sokka ushered everyone onto Appa. A loud yip yip sent the bison soaring into the sky and toward the nearby village they'd seen from the sky earlier. Naruto didn't dare turn his back on Azula now. Any chance of him prevailing and putting out this fire depended solely on his reaction time. Sending your friends away? She chuckled softly. Such a shame, your fangirls won't be able to collect your corpse. Naruto shook his head in disbelief. Crazy didn't even begin to define this girl. Look, when I said we can fight any time, I didn't think you'd be so. A fireball silenced him, obliterating a newly born tree before he could finish. So what now? Now? Azula growled, her teeth bared. Now it's over. You're tired from recreating that forest, and you have no place to go. You can run, but I'll catch you. I may not be able to reclaim my honor by killing you, but it'll at least make me feel that much better. Naruto nearly facepalmed. Did you listen to anything I said? You're banished, just like Zuko, except capturing me won't restore your... A searing line of flame across his cheek cut him off. Don't even think about running. Azula circled him, a predator ready to pounce. Who said anything about running? Naruto sighed, reaching back to remove his cloak, casting the garment aside with an errant flick of his wrist. In case you've forgotten, I've beaten you once already, twice. If you'd like to count this afternoon. Behind Azula's pale skin, the slow flushing of her face looked almost like a growing forest fire, and she seemed literally unable to catch her breath. Oh yes, she remembered. She burned at the memory of how soundly she'd been beaten. Unthinking in her exasperation, she lashed out, flinging a fireball at him in anger. It was a mistake. Naruto simply raised a hand, Rinnegan flaring, and absorbed it. Just like that, her blue-black flames rippled harmlessly against his unseen shield. Her own power siphoned away, leaving him even stronger than before. That wasn't very nice. You mean I'm not good enough for you? You're hurting my feelings. Too bad, Naruto growled. I don't want to hear lies from you. I want the truth. Are you enjoying this? Are you sure? Her smile had just a touch of madness to it. I'm a pretty good liar. It's a crying shame your fighting skills aren't as good, he retorted. That did it. I'll show you skill. Naruto moved like water, form and volume but shifting, changing, never in one place for more than the span of 2 beats, never allowing her to touch him, or so much as even graze him in her endless assault. His quick and clever movements infuriated Azula to no end. Had he been toying with her before? He stepped forward, so too did something else. The spirit registered as a black and white blur between the two of them, roaring and lashing out in the time it took for both warriors to blink. Its claws sank not into their flesh, but into their spirits, violently tearing them free and casting them into each other. Even Naruto, with his super-sensitive senses, only registered this much. He had the sense of being flung into something, but everything was so out of focus that he could barely try to breath, let alone think, as the universe blurred around him. Suddenly, the universe began to unblur. Naruto blinked in surprise, his world reeling, his skin numb. One moment he had been fighting Azula, and the next this? He found himself staring at himself, utterly unable to believe what had happened, or how it had happened. What the devil was going on here? Was he staring at a clone? But no, he hadn't created one. What was going on here? He became aware of his own shuffling footsteps, his shallow breathing, blood rushing in his ears, sweat beading upon his brow. Then he looked down, and what he saw there turned his spine to ice. Why were his hands so small? And why was he wearing armor? More importantly, why did his chest feel so damn heavy? He took a tottering step forward, suddenly aware of hair before his visage, those ebony tresses blotting out his vision for the smallest of seconds. Naruto froze, touched a hand to his face, then his chest. Oh no! Suddenly, a voice yelled out sweet agony in holy flames, causing him to crane his neck in that direction. The forest was still burning around him, so it was difficult to properly believe what he was seeing or if it was just the soot in his lungs. Why are you standing there? His body sputtered in a feminine tone, shattering all doubt. Stop messing with my body like that. What are you? Oh crap. It was Azula's voice that emerged from his mouth, albeit with a slight drawl. What he had thought was a clone was his own frightened body, staring back at him with horror and trepidation. But that wasn't him standing there, and if wasn't standing there, had he just swapped bodies with Azula? Stop that this instant. Naruto in Azula's body paused in what he was doing, shirt poised just over his midsection, exposing the pale flesh of her stomach for all the moonlight to see. This hesitation was only momentary, however, and with a flick of the wrist sent the soaked garment flying to join the rest in the pile. All the armor and trappings she had worn had been cast aside onto the riverbank, her boots and gloves removed, leaving the shinobi-turned-firebender clad only in a pair of battered breeches and mere moments before, the tattered remains of a shirt torn by brambles and briars. "I'm sorry, was that important?" He grinned, golden eyes flashing in the night as he hooked his thumbs in the broken waistband of her pants. "In that case, you won't mind if I stop. It's your fault we're both sopping wet to begin with," Naruto pointed out at last, slinging her technically now his wet clothes over a nearby branch. "We had to dive into the lake to get away from the flames, remember that? Just be thankful it didn't spread any further." He risked a pointed glance to the charred remnants of the forest. A forest he'd only just restored. "Which reminds me." "No!" Azula grabbed for him, but she was still unaccustomed to this new, tall, bulky body. Shio reached in her attempt to stop Naruto's treacherous stripping, and in doing so, found the pants flung in her face. Her balance sufficiently sundered, the former princess was sent tumbling backward to land face first in the drink. Naruto's lilting laughter, the laughter of her body, the scoundrel, echoed after her, mocking the once proud bender for her tiny and feeble attempt to stop him. Azula growled, ripped the leathers off her face, and pushed her body back into off the shallows, propping herself up on her hands and knees. "I swear when I catch you, not much to catch here, darling." Azula froze as she caught sight of Naruto again, and promptly started spluttering. "Are you what?" Now he stood before her clad only in her undergarments. Adding insult to injury, he'd even struck a pose. Were it not for that black lace bra and underwear, well, Azula didn't want to complete that thought. And then, just when she was certain matters could not prove any worse, that the fates themselves could no mock her any more than they already had, they did. "Wow, these girls are a lot bigger than I'd thought they'd be, Azula," Naruto mused, fondling them between those her delicate hands. "Nice body, too, and you're only what, 17? Gotta admit, whoa." His head dipped backwards abruptly. A heartbeat later Azula crashed into the ground, her arms closing around nothingness as the shinobi cartwheeled away with an almost effortless ease. In that instant, he almost reminded her of Ty Lee, the way he spun gracefully, deceptively delicate, then darted back towards her with sudden, straightforward power. "You've been keeping in shape, I see," he trilled pleasantly, mocking with her own voice. "I had to admit, I was a little worried about swapping bodies for a bit there, but I think this is a nice trade, don't you? I may not have any chakra to work with, but I'm nimble as ever, and you ha ha ha." "Nice try." This time, she managed to get a handful of his hair before he escaped her large, rough hands, snatching a few stray strands before he lashed up and out with his heel and struck upward. At first, Azula didn't understand what he was doing. Yes, the blow would certainly sting a little, but why was he aiming so high? Pain. That was Azula's only thought as she crumpled to the ground. Stars, whole planets, detonated before her vision, leaving her blinded to all else except the pain between her legs. Naruto chuckled mirthlessly, and before the pompous princess had a much-needed chance to recover, he threw her back into the water, face first. The once proud royal gasped as water flooded her nostrils, his body floundering helplessly in the drink for a heart-stopping instant of pure terror before finally she managed to get the arms back under her control. One thought dominated her mind: vengeance, swift and certain. "When I get out of this, I am going to kill him." Strong hands pushed up against the riverbed, levering her head up just enough to voice her complaint, followed by a mouthful of water. Anger painted her every feature. Her mouth was contorted in a rictus of white-hot fury so intense that the water itself seemed to steam off her face. That was as much as her powers seemed to amount to in this body steam. Naruto was waiting for her there on the bank when she finally clambered back to the bank, legs crossed and arms folded, looking every inch the lady in her body. Hell, he'd even managed to redress himself while she'd been busy trying not to drown, having Gao-en taken her hair out of the bun content to run her finger through the dark tresses. "Did you enjoy your bath?" he asked mildly with her voice. "Oh, you have such soft hair." This was added with grin, I'll have to consider growing mine out sometime, Azula growled. Bath? She hissed, low and fierce. Yes, I believe that's what I said. Naruto's golden eyes glittered back at her. Then how about I give you one? Enraged both by her impromptu soak and what the Avatar was putting her through, Azula tried to fling a fireball at him. All that emerged was a harmless puff of feeble smoke. Not even the tiniest ember would obey her. Naruto looked at her for a long moment, full lips twitching in bemusement grand gaze. Then he frowned, and his voice became like death, the same death she doled out to more than a few servants in her childhood for failing to please her. He rose from the long in one smooth movement, his now golden eyes regarding her coolly. More than one guard had been on the receiving end of that awful glare, and although it was still her face, Azula felt herself quail a bit when she looked into those hazel eyes. Then Naruto's newfound visage hardened and she realized what he was about to say. The same thing she herself had often said to those she considered to be beneath her. I believe someone needs a lesson in humility. He stepped forward and struck like a viper, sending her sprawling back into the water with a deceptively swift swing of his heel. That was all it took. Another swing swept her visage into the muck, eliciting an impromptu shriek of surprise from her new body. Azula choked out a desperate gasping breath, rose on those quavering hands and knees, only to find her head ruthlessly taken hold of and driven back under yet again. Her nose pressed up the muck of the riverbed. Her body thrashed and floundered, but even in this form, even in her body, Naruto was simply too strong for her. The more she struggled, the more it hurt. Her body refusing to respond with the awesome strength he had displayed, this body had displayed during their previous clashes. It was frightening. What's going on here? Growing ever more frantic, losing oxygen with each passing second, Azula tried to call upon her bending, only to remember once more that this body lacked any sort of chi. Without it, she was as helpless as a newborn and twice as fragile, powerless. Her strength meant nothing to her in this body. Somehow, that thought terrified her even more. Weakness was her greatest fear. Without her bending, without her agility, without any of was she nothing. Her mind worked frantically, scrabbling for a solution, anything at all, but in her panic she couldn't get her arms around to grapple with him, and with his knees pinning her legs. Abruptly, Naruto stood up and pulled at the last minute, freeing her from a watery grave. Azula gasped and inhaled, sweet, glorious air flooding her lungs as Naruto held her head out of the water. His visage came back into focus as she blinked the pain away from her eyes, her own face staring down at her with chilling dispassion. Are you quite done? His tone was light, but she could hear the steel beneath, utterly uncaring that he nearly drowned her in his own body. I'll do this as many times as I have oof. His words ended in a startled grunt as Azula bucked, using her larger body to rear back and kick him in the face, hard. To her surprise, Naruto made no move to dodge. Even when the back of her boots slammed into his chin with all its might, there was a silence. The princess unable to believe she'd actually struck him, the Shinobu startled to find he'd actually felt it. A trickle of blood trickled down from his mouth, trailing across a cheek and down his chin. Suddenly and without warning, Naruto's grin folded in on itself, his expression thunderous, golden eyes full of murder. He turned, spat out a tooth, clicked his jaw, and to her horror smiled. It was not a pleasant thing, that smile, not by any means. Oh, he hissed, the words veritably dripping with venom, a little fighting, yeah. I like that, and I'm going to love this. In the time it took for those words to pass between them, for Azula to shudder in fear, Naruto did not attack. Instead, he simply moved. First, much to her infinite dismay, the blonde turned black cat reared back and spat, launching a scarlet gob of spittle and blood back in Azula's face, blinding her, preventing her from attacking again. In that split second of hesitation as she flailed, he struck again, his forehead slamming hers like a barreling platypus bear, sending several stars of agony detonating before her sight one by one. Even as she struggled to recover, she felt those slim hands wrap round her throat and force her into the murky lake once more. And down we go. Azula barely had time to suck in a breath before he shoved her visage into the shallows again. She thrashed and flailed, knowing she was using up her air, but to no avail. Every fiber of her being, her very soul, screamed that he wouldn't let her up for air this time, that he'd honest agony kill her inside his body and consequences be damned. And she fought, lamenting her inability to prevent her own demise, cursing herself for seeking out this cruel creature, cursing fate for taking her body away and leaving her powerless, but above all, cursing the man known as Uzumaki Naruto. When he let her up for air again, She wanted to weep at her own powerlessness. When she tried to gouge his eyes out, he simply put her under again. He did this time after time, bringing her up, waiting for her to lunge and summarily to allow her a shallow gasp of air, only to push her under for her impudence each time. With each reprimand her strikes grew weaker and weaker, until at last she recognized the futility of her efforts. For the moment, to struggle any further was to risk her own life by drowning. At long last Naruto let her up for air. This time, Azula did not resist. "Are you done?" he asked again. "Yes," she replied meekly. "Good." He grunted and tossed back onto the bank. She didn't even have the strength to make a sound as her body struck the dirt. "Not yet. This is humiliating," Azula said with bleakness in her voice. "First I get banished, then my ship sinks, then I swap bodies with the buffoon, and now this." "Speak for yourself," he shot back. "This body has speed and strength, but no endurance whatsoever." He flexed the wrist for emphasis. "See? Pretty sure I fractured this damn thing hitting you, not to mention losing a tooth back there. And on top of that, my face is swelling from that kick of yours. Shit, if it weren't for these assets I'd..." Somehow, Azula almost produced a fireball at that remark. "Careful now," Naruto chortled as he danced away. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." Azula snarled, a glimmer of her old self rising to the fore, summoned by his words. "You say that and yet you're the one hurting in the end." If she'd expected to rile him, she would be sorely disappointed. Naruto gave a very unladylike snort and pranced past her, utterly uncaring for the threat his own body posed. "Police," the blackhead snorted. "I know for a fact that my body is far more durable than that. You simply lack the will to control it, is all. Give it a day or two, it'll heal right up, you know? Stop speaking that slang with my mouth." Before she could aim for Naruto, the nimble fighter was already onto her. A first uppercut made her lose her footing. Her fist frantically hit nothing but void and the air around her. An elbow then came smashing directly against her face, further destabilizing her as HSE backed several steps away under the impact. Angered, she wiped away a trickle of blood that was flowing from the corner of her lips as she stared down at Naruto, holding his guard up, but with an ironic grin that screamed invitation for more, and more she would give him. Rushing him with a shriek, Azula drew upon all her skill, all she knew of combat. Bending or not, he was just as disadvantaged as she was, if she could just get close. Naruto surprised her then. He stood his ground, features clenched tight in concentration, and thrust a fist outward. Azula didn't slow. There was no way he could bend in her body, just no way. The hairs on the back of her neck stood at sudden attention as the temperature spiked. No, she rolled aside just in time, a split second before a stream of blue fire enveloped where she'd been standing. She gazed at Naruto, baffled. At first he seemed just as surprised as she, but then that shock settled into steely resolve. Finally, he hissed, "I've figured out how your body works." "What?" Azula never finished that sentence as Naruto struck again, punching the air even as she clambered to her feet. This time there was no thin flickering stream of fire. It was so much more. "That shouldn't be," she faltered, her charge stalling as a massive blast of blue fire erupted into existence, the fireball bearing down on her with ruthless intent. "Too fast. I won't make it in time." Azula threw herself aside, but too little late. She screamed as she rolled aside, the fires glancing her arm before she could to escape, and then it was past, the scorching heat roaring onward, detonating harmlessly in the lake. "But you how?" Azula spluttered, clutching at her arm. Naruto snickered wordlessly, grinning as he twirled a tongue of blue fire in his palm. "How are you firebending? I've had an entire lifetime to study you firebenders. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out once I gained access to chi?" His grin inexplicably grew. "Now, how did Iroh create lightning? Something about separating the chi and allowing to flow through you, hey?" He laughed, replicating the movements. "My fingers are sparking. I think I've almost got it. Will you stop it? You're going to fry us." Bzzzt. A deafening crackle ended her complaint, as a stream of black lightning erupted from Naruto's fingertips and scorched a crater between them. Naruto whistled that he beheld his handiwork. "Not bad for my first try." Azula was baffled. How could she be so clumsy in this body while he remained so nimble? Her every skill felt impeded. She couldn't even summon up the rage nor the agility needed to capture him. It was infuriating, as if something were actively blocking her, impeding her every movement. Almost as if. "Right you are," Naruto replied sagely, as though he'd somehow read her very mind. I've had someone try to take my body once before. It wasn't entirely pleasant, yes'ree. When you're as paranoid as I am, you learn to place a few limiters on yourself. They were set to trigger in case my spirit ever left my body against its will. All you've access to now is an awkward, uncoordinated shell. Hell, you probably can't even use my chakra. I, on the other hand, find no such block in this body of yours. I'm curious to learn what it's capable of, but I'm kinda focused on this nice body right now. Not to mention the tattoo I gave you earlier. Azula paled. Tattoo. That's a secret. Naruto cupped her breasts for emphasis. Stop touching them, or by Agni, I will burn you to ashes. There was a silence. His lips curled into a smile as he watched her seethe. Wouldn't you just be burning your own body? Arg. 5 minutes of failed attempts later on her part, and they were right back where they started. She lay flopped on the bank, only this her right arm, his arm, was screaming in pain, badly burned at the shoulder. Naruto didn't even bother to help her, though it was technically his body that had been scorched. What are you waiting for? Azula cried out, clutching her wound. Help me. You brought this upon yourself. His visage remained stern. I may play the prankster, but that doesn't mean I can't be serious. He rose from his crouch and started toward her at a gait. I've fought worse villains, the like of which you'll never know. Some I converted, forced them to see the error of their ways, others, well, I'm sure you can guess. He stood over her now, contemplating her in his body. It would be so easy to finish where I started with you now, don't you think? With this body of yours, I could wreak all kinds of havoc. He reached down, cupping her whiskered chin in hand. So, the question remains, what the devil should I do with you now? Decisions, so, what'll it be? Bite me. Oh no, he feigned horror. Is that your best? Ha! Although you should be careful. Ha! Azula gulped as he moved to straddle her. A look then that sent small shivers shooting down her spine, and not necessarily bad ones. I'm not above screwing myself, Azula. That sent her face, or was it Naruto's? Gah, burning brighter than Susan's comet. How could he be so brazen like that? Did you think I was serious? He snickered, pulling away. But fun and games aside, this is a good chance for the two of us to talk. Why on earth would I speak to you, Avatar? A blast of fire scorched the earth mere millimeters from her head. That's why. Naruto lowered his hand, smiling serenely. Azula weighed her options. With this body in such a sorry state, she really had no way of counteracting her own bending in and way. If she resisted, she was done for. If she stayed her tongue, however, she might be able to discover more information on the Avatar, and thereby a way to take him down. It galled her to yield like this, but she truly had no choice. Fine, good girl. Naruto patted his forehead with a benign palm, but there was a distant, misty glint in those eyes as his fingers grazed over her forehead. I'll be frank with you, princess. It was never my intention to have you banished as you were. Believe what you will, but trust me when I say I know what you're going through. He chuckled bitterly. It's ironic, isn't it? We both know what it's like to lose everything and be left with nothing. That expression, on her face, was suddenly dour, almost somber, even. I've had to watch as my friend's family, even the land I once dwelled upon, were taken from me, devoured by the progress of time and mankind. Likewise, you've had everything taken from you, not by time, but by your royal prick of a father. You don't know anything about me, Azula hissed, and my father is a great man. A great flaming asshole is what he is, Naruto snapped back. I bet he's never once told you he loves you. Her pained expression, however slight, must have given it away, for he smirked. Didn't think so. And, as to your earlier statement, I know more than you think, girl. You're an open book to me. For starters, you have an inferiority complex because of Ozai. You fear rejection, so you see to control others with fear and intimidation as your sword and shield, never allowing any close enough to care. His fingers brushed her forehead again, and this time Azula could feel him probing within her mind. Was he regaining his strength? Did his power derive from the body instead of the spirit? If that was the case, she was in dire straits indeed. She bristled as his mind brushed her once again, helpless to do anything but quiver. Socially awkward, too. It seems my and Tylee are the closest thing to actual friends. Wonder how they feel about you being banished? Azula froze at the mention of her friends in question, a cold hand of fear gripping her heart. The things Naruto might do to them. Stop it! But the Avatar did not stop. Not to mention the whole thing with your mother thinking you're a monster. Stop it! And you're jealous of Zuko because she paid more attention to him? Wow, but in any case that's why I told you to stop. Azula begged with tears in her eyes. She didn't think she could take any more of this. I'd like you to join us, Naruto finished. Subsequently, the silence was deafening. Join you? Did I stutter? Golden eyes flashed in warning, and once more Azula found herself cowed, even in her own body. The blonde knew how to put her in place, not just as a firebender, but as a person. I think you would be a fine addition to the team. Besides, for all our disagreements, we're more alike than you'd care to admit. You're not pure evil, just misunderstood. It might be the old me speaking here, but I still think there may be hope for you yet. He blanched at her unreadable expression. A slim hope, but still. Azula actually flushed. Why? Why are you being so kind to me? Naruto chuckled, coming from Azula's mouth. It sounded oddly girlish. I told you, there's potential in ya. You could do great things for this world with your power and influence. Wonderful things. At that, his visage took on a contemplative expression. Let's say, for example, once I beat and butchered your father, you became the next Fire Lord. Say you actually ruled with a steady hand? Of course, you'd have to overcome your complex first. The fire, she began. Also your fault. I know. Azula snapped back. I'm sorry. Forget I said anything. Just shut up. Once you've considered my offer, I will. For a moment, Azula actually considered it. She recalled Uzumaki Naruto defeating her so effortless back on Kyoshi, ending her life only to revive her again. Maybe you'll come back as a different person. The Avatar had spoke softly to her then. Those words, a gentle trickle of compassion so different from the rapidity of hatred and fear she had encountered all her life. Just now, he'd spoken to her the same way. She hung her head at these words, trying to decipher the feelings churning through her chest. I've really lost, haven't I? She could feel the immediate and familiar rise of contempt for her opponent at the mere concept of this Avatar pitying her. Azula could also sense the rusty emotion of respect for Naruto, for this fighter who was fueled by love rather than rage, and almost completely eclipsed by these two other emotions. Azula could feel the longing for a companion, for someone to talk to, for someone to help her off the ground when she's down. Where's the happiness in that? Perhaps for someone to love her, even when she fails. Like hell. The sudden realization that she was even considering herself weak brought a wave of rage to her mind with the ferocity of a great and dark tempest, despite her opponent's mercy towards him. Naruto looking down in her eyes, pleading for him to stop. The anger won over Azula and she yanked her arm out of the Avatar's gentle grip. Don't you fuck with me, you bastard! She roared, swarming up against him with her good arm, her fingers finding his throat. You took everything from me. I'll never work with you. I'd sooner see you dead. Is that so? For a genuine moment, the Avatar actually seemed sad. Well then, if you insist on being uncooperative, I suppose I'll have to eliminate you for good this time. It took everything she had not to scream as he ignited his foremost finger and pushed it to her forehead, the heat of that lone fingertip sizzling into her flesh. Odd. Why were his fingers glow? Naruto cringed as the world between him and Azula blurred once more. Boundaries, his vision doing a 180. Instead of standing, he found himself on the ground, eyes rolling back in his head, wincing as pain flooded his body and soul. His mind brushed against Azula's for a terrifying instant. All her anger, fear and hatred were communicated to him in that instant, and then, as swiftly and inexplicably as it had begun, their brief union was done. Naruto found himself peering up at Azula, and she down at him, each torn between confusion and exultation. Somehow, someway, they were back in their bodies again. He himself nearly laughed, all the while fighting the urge to scream as his wounds made themselves evident. His body remained covered in small burns, but it was his shoulder that ached the worst, the charred flesh protesting, to even the slightest rise and fall of his chest. Ah crap, he silently swore as he rolled his aching joint in its socket. It wouldn't heal until tomorrow at the earliest, but now, it was only a liability to him. He could feel it healing, but much too slowly. Well, Naruto coughed up at her. Looks like the tables have turned. Indeed they have. Azula's smile ranked right up there with his top 3 fears, superseded only by the terror of all things ghostly and a world without ramen. Such a shame. A few more minutes and you might have had me there. Despite himself, Naruto feigned a smile at those words. In his present state, she might actually be able to capture him, or worse, end him right here and now. But his hand was still on her throat, something a veteran like Azula should have noticed. And yet she hadn't. It would be so easy just to snap her neck and be done with it. As such, it came as a complete surprise when she jerked her head around and bit him. Bit him. Naruto blinked in surprise, recoiled from the unexpected move. Don't worry, Azula purred, I'm not going to kill you. First, I'm going to make you suffer, starting with those hussies you hold so dear. Naruto snorted. Those hussies could kick your ass 7 ways to Sunday. His gaze suddenly hardened. And, on the off chance you did harm them, I'd kill you. I don't take kindly to those who threaten my precious people, you too well. I won't hurt you unless you make it necessary. She tilted her head to the side in question. Will it be necessary? Probably. Before she could level a retort of her own, the blonde levered himself upward on his good arm and spun with his feet, striking not at Azula but at everything around her. The blast was nothing short of spectacular. Currents of wind chakra erupting from his legs, windmilling, forcing Azula to take a step backwards as a current of wind chakra propelling him bodily backwards towards the lake. Even as he flew, he righted himself, pouring chakra into the soles of his boots, gaining traction where there was none to be found. There was distance between them now, and distance was all he needed. Thank Kami he mastered one-handed seals all those years ago. I never thought I'd be more grateful to Haku. Besides, I can't die here. Something strange happened then. His charred shoulder, the one he was certain he'd never regain full functionality with, began to heal. It rapidly mended before his eyes. Burned flesh stitched itself back together in an instant. All the burns his body had accumulated disappearing in the blink of an eye. Both blonde and blackhead blinked, baffled by this turnaround. Naruto flexed his newly healed limb. Looks like my regeneration isn't ready to quit on me just yet, after all, which means, Azula blanched. Can't we talk about this? No. Naruto's golden aura leapt back to life, his cloak larger and more intense than ever. The rapidly darkening skies lit up with the unearthly light, this golden radiance trembling at the return of the Avatar. An avatar of the gods. The next thing Azula knew, she was flying back, her face now adorned by something best described as a dent in her cheeks. The next thing she knew, she was knocked upwards. A blinking gold light was growing larger at the end of his vision. The next, she was knocked back down. And the next thing Azula knew, for quite some time after that, was pain. Did you hear something? Hear what? Suki perked up, her attention drawn not by Katara's voice, by the sound of a thunderclap in the distance. Naruto had been gone for several hours now, and in that time, much had occurred. The village they had taken refuge in had been attacked by a spirit. Sokka and Haru had been kidnapped by said spirit, forcing Aang to go after them, only to vanish into the forest, never to return. The sky had grown horribly dark since then, and although morning was fast approaching, no sign of the sun could be seen. Spirits, where were they? Hear what? That. The waterbender turned her gaze toward the skies as thunder roared through the heavens. Suki flinched as a dull rumble rippled through the earth. Evidently Naruto's battle with Azula had resumed in earnest, or worse. For them to feel the effects of their battle even from here was truly a feat of wonder. Momo cringed, whimpering as lightning split the sky. Appa covered his head with a paw. Katara sympathized. The fear she felt was not just for herself but for that of Naruto as well, if not more. Son. She knew he was capable of world-shattering feats. And yet if this continued, I hope he's alright. Azula reeled from yet another impossibly strong blow. She's lost count. Her opponent was an unstoppable force of nature, it seemed, and defeat was growing near. To think he'd been holding back this entire time. But no longer, she realized, as another blow dropped her into the earth, only for a second to launch her into the skies moments later. A third sent her body caroming off the soil, once again mercifully putting her body out of range from the deadly and almost unseen strikes. Yes, she was back in her body. For all the good it had done her, Naruto was dominating her, proving his superiority once more. Kami, to think she almost missed having him in her. Oh Christ, that came out Sarang. Why are you standing there? Naruto called down to her, striding down upon the air itself. Aren't you going to fight back? Azula scrambled away, putting some distance between herself and this impossible fighter. She stared at Naruto's defiant figure, almost unable to believe what she'd been put through because of this one simple avatar, this mere man. I will not stand for this. Too bad, Naruto's voice whispered in her ear. When had he gotten behind her? Causing the princess to start in surprise. You don't get a say, not anymore. Bakram. Her face kissed the soil that had bruised with enough force to make her bounce. Before she could recover, Naruto was there, trapping her in a prison of earth. binding her arms and legs before could even think to fling both at him and escape. "Congratulations, you're my prisoner at the moment. Now I'm going to present you with one of two choices," he said slowly. "Join us, or die, for good this time." For emphasis he held up a hand, revealing a small yet rapidly growing raisin shuriken held in his palm. Azula bristled at the sight of that technique, trying to skitter backwards despite her bonds and failing miserably. It swelled with each passing second, rapidly expanding, the keening shriek of its sour note threatening to drown out everything else and end her life. "Well?" Naruto asked. "What's it going to be?" Several minutes later, Naruto, the mismatched blonde, turned as he strode into the village, Azula slung over his shoulder like a rag doll. Not quite the way he'd intended to introduce her to the group, but it'd have to do. Now he paused at the sound of Suki's voice. Mere seconds later the Kyoshi warrior slammed into him, nearly bowling the blonde over, causing him to drop his charge in favor of embracing his assailant. Slender arms wrapped round his chest and drew him to her, her face all but buried in his burnt shirt. Any attempt to extricate himself proved pointless. She simply moved with him. Hey! Naruto grunted his surprise and managed to wriggle his way free and hold her at arm's length. "I'm fine, Suki." "Why were you crying?" Had she been wearing her warrior makeup it would have been horribly smudged by now, as it were those hazel orbs remained red and puffy. The poor thing looked as though she'd been bawling her eyes out. "You know I'm perfectly fine, MMMPH. His mind exploded into white as her mouth struck his, her lips connecting with a suddenness he hadn't expected. It was his first kiss in over a century. His eyes shot open in surprise. Her kiss was cool but gentle, her two lips caging his upper lip between them. Part of him wanted to balk, to ask why she was doing this, but he was completely overwhelmed by her. As she released her wrist and cupped his cheek with her hand, he soon found himself returning the kiss, deepening it as she opened her mouth and slid her tongue out and against his. She reached upwards with her arms and wrapped them around his neck, a soft whimper fleeing their coupled mouths as he pulled her body closer to his. How long had it been since he'd felt this? A part of him knew it was foolish to have feelings for a teenager, especially when he himself had lived for hundreds of years. But he found it impossible to resist, his arms taking matters into their own hands, refusing to relinquish their hold upon the young maiden before him. What was it about her that attracted him so? There were no words, nothing to explain how he felt, how his heart all but soared in his chest from their lip lock. It was like having something live for again. No longer would he shuffle from place to place while wearing the mask of jester. Now he actually had something to fight for, something. For a moment it was just that, just the two of them, just. Ahem. At the sound of Katara's voice, Suki jerked back as if she'd been burned. "Sorry," she whispered, her lips leaving his, but refusing to release his arms. "Don't be," Naruto replied, catching the slight shiver his words elicited in her. "I thought you were." "She's been like that ever since you left," Katara said, coming up beside him. Thankfully she made no move to embrace him, contenting herself to a slight smile at his return. "Good to have you back." But there was a touch of steel in her eyes, a quiet anger he'd come to know all too well. He'd have some explaining to do, but for now, he offered a grin of his own, relieved to find his charges unharmed. "But where have you been?" Naruto explained what had happened at length, careful to omit the interesting parts as he informed his students of what had occurred. "Seriously?" Suki balked. "You guys swapped? I thought that only happened in cartoons." "Suki, this is a cartoon." "What?" "No, it isn't, actually. If the two of you are quite done breaking the fourth wall," Katara interrupted, her gaze straying to the prone princes. "What is she doing here?" "She's going to teach Aang firebending," Naruto replied simply. Their combined deadpan was barely concealed, momentarily united by their shared confusion. "What?" Azula groaned at that, stirring from her slumber at last. She's awake," Naruto commented mildly. Good, this makes things easier?" He trailed off as Azula bolted to her feet and shoved a finger in his face. Katara and Suki bristled, well aware she could easily blow his head off with lightning, but Naruto didn't so much as bat an eyelash. "Did you want something?" The blonde blinked. Azula growled, "Listen, Avatar, I can join your group, or I can do something unspeakably horrible to you and your friends, your choice." Coming from her mouth those words sounded quite strange, most strange indeed. She was likely trying to save face in front of Katara and Suki, but when faced with such a threat, he simply burst out laughing. "What's so funny?" Naruto managed to explain between bouts of delirious snickering. You really need to work on your people skills, Azula. A final chuckle and he straightened, his blue eyes adopting a semi-serious expression. And besides, you're asking the wrong person. The ex-princess offered a soft sound that only made a tree expression even more priceless. You mean you're not the Avatar? An Avatar, yes, but the Avatar? Naruto grinned as he revealed the ruse. Nope. But thanks for joining us. The slow coloring of Azula's face was possibly the most priceless thing in the world. You damn cheeky dash. Speaking of cheeky, where's Aang? Naruto frowned. I haven't seen him, or Sokka or Haru, Katara told him. A spirit? Seriously? Well, yes, this is why I don't leave you guys alone.